Salt Lake City, in the backyard of famed alternative researcher John Levi. And one could certainly understand why John Levi would go about the city of Salt Lake City and understand that there's something amiss with the accounts that we've been given. I certainly see it as one of the primary examples, and if only we lived in a world where something like this would be true, where we actually had a field of studies that concerned itself with alternative history. We're told that Salt Lake City was settled initially by the Church of Latter-day Saints in 1847 with a group of 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children. Now, it's very strange that this small group would be the group that would start Salt Lake City, and if you do the ratios and the math on it, none of it makes any sense. But in reality, it's no different than any of the other original settlement accounts that we have of the other cities that we've explored. Interestingly enough, in 23 short years, they managed to quickly establish a grid pattern and develop many buildings, that small group of people, to include a very large and impressive temple, which stands to this day. Supposedly, they started construction on it only a few short years after they started settling Salt Lake City. And that's a reason why this is one of the strangest accounts. And it's something we have to question because here is the temple itself, and yet on this bird's eye view, this is from 1870. Yet we're told that the temple wasn't finished until the early 1890s. So already we have a vast conflicting account. Was the artist on this bird's eye view simply being imaginative and showing what the temple would look like once it was concluded? It's hard to say. It's still impressive and bizarre that in just a few short years, 23 short years, the Salt Lake City Temple and the Tabernacle were constructed and finished. Now, we'll be given a more reasonable timeline, at least for the Temple, and the fact that we're told it took them 40 years. Still, it's an astounding achievement to not only build a temple, not only build the Tabernacle, which is the dome structure below, and supposedly that was finished in the late 1860s. But again, who knows about these dates and these accounts? These are things that we have to question. Here's an early construction photo of the Salt Lake City Temple, or the Mormon Temple, whatever you want to actually call it. And these construction photos have the same issues that we see with others. I like how they're just showing the blocks laying there in nice order. Well, at least they have an orderly construction site. You would think they would have been able to finish the temple a lot faster. I mean, it's not as though they needed any sort of labor. We don't really know if there are aspects of the account of the settlement of Salt Lake City that we don't have. It's just strange, though, that we start with only 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children. Yet they were able to pull off this incredible edifice. Even if this was the only building that they built in Salt Lake City in those 40 years, just for that group of people that we're told, it doesn't make any sense. Either there's something to this account, there's information that we don't have, or this is evidence of something strange going on. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that's the situation with every city. And yet, in the latter portion of the 19th century, we already have photos that show the completion of many of these incredible buildings in Salt Lake City, all done within even a few short decades, which, as I said, with the supposed amount of labor that they had available, 143 men and 3 women, and maybe they had the children working too, because child labor was a thing back then, perhaps they were able to erect this temple in that short amount of time. I mean, still, to me, it's impressive in 40 years. Moving around those kind of granite blocks and having them chopped and organized, it's very impressive. So that's the reason why Salt Lake City has our interest as alternative researchers, because it's one of the real smoking guns, if you will, that shows you that either the account that we're given could not possibly be correct, or there's something else going on. Now, here's what Salt Lake City looks like in the 1890s, and in this bird's eye view, we see even more build-out. And keep in mind, we haven't even had people there for 40 years yet. It is unbelievable. And yes, you'll say, well, but this is a bird's eye view from 1890. True. But when they made the bird's eye view, it had to be before 1890, and you're only looking at the 40-year mark of settlement from that small group of people. Now, could other Mormons, other settlers have come along and gradually went to this city in the middle of nowhere at that time, very isolated from the rest of the United States? Of course, it's possible. But it's really strange that all these stunning achievements were completed in such a short amount of time, that this community from a group of people that were persecuted and chased all around the United States, which is what the official count tells us, they were able to pull all this off. It's impressive. It's stunning. And here's an earlier photo of the construction of the temple from 1881. So what's really going on here? Is the timeline being shortened? Are we not giving all the details from the official account? Is this some sort of evidence of alternate realities? This could be anything and everything. And that's one of the reasons this is probably one of the more interesting conflicting accounts that we have. There's been recent renovations on the temple in Salt Lake City. When we pull back the veil, if you will, a little bit, you start to see that the building itself seems to go into the ground a lot more than we realize. There's also a lot of questions and conflicting accounts with the construction of the building itself. And we'll look at it a little closer just to give you an idea as to why the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City is such an anomaly. We see in some of these closer photos that it appears that the foundation goes a lot deeper in the ground than we'd like to think. And so we have a lot of the classic hallmarks with this particular temple that we come across in the other buildings that we've looked at in other cities. Now, of course, people say, well, yes, but in the other cities it made more sense, they had a developed infrastructure, there were more people around, and those are true facts. And yet at the same time, when you examine the origin accounts of these other cities, it's actually quite a lot like Salt Lake City. A minimal group of people with minimal resources and no consideration with logistics whatsoever were able to achieve these stunning, remarkable buildings in a short amount of time. It just doesn't make any sense. Yet you look at this and you see the foundation and you see some of the details in this building. And as we zoom in a little bit here, we can see how far the foundation really does go down in the ground. And how deep does it go down? Well, there's a lot of accounts on the ground that'll tell you that the building goes down in the ground a lot deeper than we've been told or we'd like to think. And I find myself considering the fact that some of the other remarkable edifices we looked at in other cities, how many of them go much further in the ground and they just haven't done this kind of renovation. And another question is, what exactly has prompted this renovation on the temple in Salt Lake City? We'll, of course, be told it's because the building is over 150 years old and therefore it needs some structural improvements. Of course, the construction was finished in 1890, but they started on it in 1850. So again, you have all these conflicting accounts, you have all this overlapping information, and yet here in this photo, you can see how far down this building really goes into the ground. What exactly is going on here? Why is it so difficult for us just to get simple and direct answers that make sense? This is something we have to question when we're considering all these accounts and the origins of these cities, Salt Lake City included, and the other cities that we've explored in the eastern portion of the United States. Strangely enough, we've even seen rubbling and some destruction in some of the photos of Salt Lake City. Is there something that's being concealed? Is there something we're not supposed to know about? Now, of course, the contractors that are doing this, they're just doing their job. So to them, it's not really going to stand out too much. They might be surprised by how well constructed the building is, or there's been other accounts that the buildings aren't very well constructed. There's a recurring theme of certain state capitals that they constantly have to renovate them. Yet looking at the interior of the temple, we see a gorgeous building. It's not just the fact that they created a gorgeous building on the exterior, it's also the interior. We have to consider the details of the walls, the ceilings, all the ornate planning that went into the construction of the interior. And when we actually have construction photos, we typically see contradictions in what we see in the construction photo and then what we see in the layout of the interior. Look at the beauty, the detail. And this is an incredible structure. Yes, this is an amazing temple. Yes, this is a religious place of worship, so we're told. But you have the columns, you have what looked to be an alteration on pediments, and you have the beautiful ceiling. Once again, we have to question, if this is from a predecessor civilization, were there different aspects to it? And I know it's very astounding to even suggest such a thing, but if you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you know that's exactly what we're exploring. Because it's Salt Lake City that really stands out as something that seems to be a little bit different, because of the fact that it has a compressed account, because of the fact that, I don't know, I'd almost be more willing to accept divine intervention as an acceptable explanation for how this city was settled and how these edifices were completed in such a short amount of time. And there you see it again, more of the columns with some of the decoration on them. You still see the same hallmarks of construction. Now, someone will tell you, well, according to the historical account, it's because that there were architects that went around and they studied Athens and Rome and decided they want to build buildings like that back in the 18th century. Sure. And there was no regard for how difficult it would be logistically, how difficult it would be to acquire all these beautiful materials. And not to mention that they were still somehow able to build these buildings exactly like they supposedly did in Rome and Athens, despite the fact that there's over 1,000 years or more between the constructions. Look at this beautiful doorway here on the temple and the detail that went into this. Now, you oftentimes see this beehive symbol that's also associated with Utah. There's a lot of other symbols that get associated with Utah. Look at this gorgeous room. And here you see it as well with the detail in the ceiling and the walls. And this is something that we've seen in these other older buildings. And this is very difficult to achieve, and anyone who's in finishing will tell you that this just isn't something that they bother with modern buildings, and we'll get the usual array of reasons why we don't do it. We don't have the funds, we don't have the will, we don't have the artisans, etc. Despite the fact that we have all this incredible, remarkable technology, we can do these sort of rooms, we can do these sort of interiors, but it's just not practicable, and we have limitations on money. Oh, by the way, make sure you read about the expansion of the debt ceiling next week again. And don't worry about inflation. That never seems to be a problem. It's only a problem when you're given a reason for why certain things can't be done. So all I'm saying is I'm not really accepting all these explanations we're given. And now we move on to the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was constructed, or at least it was completed before the temple. And this is another remarkable and beautiful place of worship. And this is a very unique building because this is not a building that you see other types of this building across the United States. Although if you look a little bit more, you do get hints of this sort of construction type. So who exactly knows what's going on here? And it has a very beautiful dome, and keep in mind this is from the 1860s. And there are some very intriguing early construction photos and different renderings of what this building looked like as they were constructing it. So just to recount, this was finished in 1867, not 20 years after the 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children had arrived in Salt Lake City. And that's what I'm talking about, where we have these strange things with the facts of the settlement of a city, not just Salt Lake City, but all the other cities. It started with 3 random individuals. Here's an early photo of the tabernacle, and we also see the slabs of granite or limestone or sandstone or whatever they're going to tell us that they used to construct the temple, which they did so concurrently while they were building the tabernacle and then continued after completing the tabernacle in 1867, according to the official account. And you might notice that I'm getting a lot more leery of the official account because none of this makes any sense. And here we see a couple photos of the tabernacle and the supposed unique method of construction that they used with it. And we have the usual questions that arise when we do actually see photos of construction. Very interesting that they seem to build this building a little differently than they would other buildings, where they seem to build it all the way to the top and then built it across. You tend not to see that. Usually what you see is them starting on the foundation, but I'm sure there's somebody who's watching this video who will let me know in the comments what this construction type is and how it's something that somebody observed in Europe or in Athens from a couple centuries ago, and it all makes perfect sense. And never mind the logistical considerations. People just worked harder, and these materials were readily available. And it was no issue moving heavy granite blocks miles, hundreds of miles across the desert with no logistics, because people really didn't need to drink water or eat then, apparently. And sometimes I don't wonder if that's the case, because we come across a lot of these great structures and they don't seem to have restrooms. The inside of the tabernacle is nothing to sneeze at either, because you see we have the usual columns, and it looks like this is marble. I have not had the pleasure of being inside the tabernacle, but if anybody has, please let me know in the comments. I always think, once again, it's important to look inside these buildings because you get an entirely different story than what you see just on the outside. Look at this organ. Beautiful and incredible, and supposedly this is in the tabernacle as well, and I have no reason to doubt that. You know, it reminds me of the Alpha Omega bomb from Beneath the Planet of the Apes. Never quite seen an organ like that, and of course that's something we always focus on, is the interesting organs that we see in the large religious buildings. And there's the entire layout of the tabernacle, just a very beautiful and unique building. And there's something about it that seems, I don't know, as though it's displaced in time, displaced in existence. What's the real story behind the tabernacle? Are we to consider that they actually built it in 20 years with just a very minimal labor pool? Or are we to believe that many people just came by Salt Lake City and decided to join the group of Mormon settlers? I mean, it's possible, and maybe the account just doesn't relate it that well. Or it's part of building a myth. I'm not suggesting that people don't want to build myths and it doesn't make a lot of sense to do so. It is another consideration, and it's a fair consideration. Yet regardless of what perspective you approach it from, when you're told that this unique lattice work of wood was something that was innovated for this building and then was not really used again, or maybe it was, you just don't know, they just opted not to talk about it, it's just another example of many conflicting accounts. And another example of when you ask questions, instead of getting answers, you get 10 more questions. And then you'll be ridiculed for asking questions, which I always find is quite interesting, because nobody wants to ever have a legitimate intellectual conversation about the possibilities of things. They simply want to ridicule you for asking questions. There's nothing suspicious about that now, is there? But I understand that's just how people are indoctrinated to operate, and that's fine. Please, continue to ridicule. it actually gives clues as well. Very beautiful interior photos of this building. And this is something that you do not see as much as you do the other traditional church structures. So again, I ask the question, what exactly is going on? Because this is some of the evidence, like with Duluth, when we explored Duluth a couple months ago, we saw something that didn't really make a lot of sense. And now we go to the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. So originally this was constructed as a hotel in Salt Lake City from 1909 to 1911, and we see the usual hallmarks of such beautiful construction from that very early time frame. We have the very large foundation stones, and then we see something that exceeds Art Deco, or at least what we're told Art Deco is in beauty. We have the usual columns that are amalgamated with the wall, and we see the beautiful decorative detail. At some point, it was transitioned from being a hotel to the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. So let's just think about that. 1909 to 1911, and again, you see an incredible, beautiful building. Now, I believe John Levi's gotten on the ground. I recall one of his earlier videos where he actually looked at this building very close, and it's something else that stands out from the surrounding buildings in terms of beauty and in terms of decorative detail that you see. But it's interesting because it's, once again, not just on the outside of the building, it's also on the inside of the building. And I think that's something that we tend to miss with the Art Deco buildings, because with the Art Deco buildings, you see decorative detail along some of the walls and then in the roof, such as we did with the Plummer building in Rochester, Minnesota. But then when you actually go and you look inside the building, you see a completely different story, as you do here in the lobby. I mean, interior columns that are very beautifully decorated, lobby bits, the ceiling, and then, of course, to say nothing of the floor. I wonder what this really looked like, though, when it was constructed in the early 20th century. And yet, I find the same kind of account that I do that we just saw with the Salt Lake City Temple and the Tabernacle. And here you see it again with the beauty in the ceiling, with the chandeliers and all the decorative detail in the walls where they meet the ceiling, as though they just had infinite amounts of time and the ability to do all of this in the early 20th century. And I enjoy the fact that people say, well, of course they could do it back then. Artisans and logistics were no consideration. And that's the funny thing, is to accept the mainstream account at face value, you have to overlook a lot of things. You claim to be a purveyor of science and fact, and yet at the same time, you simply have to accept it without asking questions. That's where I always had the issue with it. This is a beautiful lobby area for this building. And we'll be told it was simply a hotel and now it was converted to a memorial building. Which, okay, fine, sensible enough, but why? Why would you have to put all this effort in this detail? One of my jokes is you always know an old world building when you can get married in it, and you know that your marriage won't break up because you got married in some ugly government building that was constructed in, 1950 or afterwards. I could see why someone would want to get married in this beautiful building. I mean, there's something that's a fairy tale quality about it, and it endures to this day. Naturally, if you tried to get married in a building after 1950, that would be all she wrote. And now on to the Utah State Capitol, which is also located in Salt Lake City. Constructed from 1912 to 1916, here we have another example of what's quote-unquote neoclassical revival, Corinthian revival. I don't know, I don't care about these architectural terms anymore. We'll just call this U.S. Capitol revival style, and we'll also say it includes democracy. And we see the usual hallmarks and the trappings of our great Capitol buildings, 1912 to 1916. This is the same time that a lot of other states were either rebuilding their previous state capitals that had burnt down, and yet you could still get a pretty beautiful state capitol from this time frame, allegedly. When I look at the columns in the pediment and the dome overall, and also the columns that go up into the dome, it's intriguing to me that you see the same construction hallmarks across all these U.S. state capitals. And there's some construction photos, and of course we have the usual questions about them. Just love the sky in all these construction photos. I'm sure, again, that's just another coincidence that there was these strange skies that existed at the time. Perhaps there was some condition with the climate that we're not made aware of, and that's why the air looked that way. Because you've always got to watch the climate. Something crazy could be going on, as recent events have shown, right? Yes. And of course we have our group of individuals who are standing proud, and it's intriguing that they didn't have the state capitol built in the 1870s, but that's because they were busy building the temple, and that was the main focus. So it all makes sense. It's all separated. I really don't know what to tell you at this point when it comes to some of these state capitals, because of the fact that in some states you have accounts where you've got 5 or 6 buildings that are built on the exact same site. And what's interesting about the Utah State Capitol is this construction that seems to support its base. And that's a unique feature to it, supposedly. But then again, all the state capitals might have this feature because, well, oftentimes we just don't see the foundation or what's really under them. And of course, there's a whole element of the underground that we're going to be exploring in upcoming explorations where we consider the connectivity of these buildings. And we go on the inside and we see no less beauty here in the Utah State Capitol. And maybe, if we're going from the mainstream account, they should just consider themselves lucky that they didn't build their state capitol after 1940 because for some reason the aesthetic appeal seemed to decline a lot. We'll also have an upcoming exploration on that when we talk about the transition of Art Deco to brutalist architecture style. But no brutalism here. Beautiful dome, beautiful arcs, beautiful columns. Even this somewhat modest entryway, we see that there's a lot more inherent beauty in this than we would in a lot of other buildings, just with the columns themselves. And this might seem modest, but the reason I highlight this is because it shows you there does seem to be a little bit more of an aspect to some of these buildings that's dedicated to function. And yet the vast preponderance of them, especially on the interior, is dedicated to beauty, such as when you look up into the dome. Now, of course, you could say, well, they could do the paintings. There's all these beautiful paintings on the inside of these capitals. Yes, there is. And isn't it interesting how, with most of these paintings, it is very difficult to find things that tend to relate to what was actually going on at the time when these state capitals were constructed, or why it actually represents the American West. Because I always go back to our benchmark exploration in the state capital of Iowa, in Des Moines. And here you see the beautiful columns, the stairway. Look at the floor. Just a gorgeous, beautiful building. And yet you also see those pressed square patterns up in the arches. And yet that's something we've also seen in other buildings that were from a slightly later period. I guess all those master artisans that were just roaming the country in vast quantities in the late 19th, early 20th century were experts in doing such things. So you get that same feeling when you walk into the state capitol as you do in the other state capitals, and you can feel it with your intuition that there's something truly special and extraordinary about this building. Not even considering the columns and the handrails and the pillars that support the construction, but the stairway. You get the feeling that it's a grand entry, and just being in it gives you the impression of feeling enlightened. And here you see an individual looking up into the dome of the state capitol. And I suppose some of these paintings closer to the floor may seem like they involve the settlement of the West, although, interestingly enough, that terrain doesn't look like we'd expect the terrain around Salt Lake City to look like in current times. But, could be artistic license or whatever. And maybe a lot of those paintings were modified after the building was founded. And now we go to the Ogden High School, and this is a beauty from the 1930s. And it wouldn't be a full exploration unless we looked at a high school. And it wouldn't be a high school unless you had some aspect of what appears to be a castle, because in the early 20th century, your high school had to seem like it was a castle, or some other strange sort of building. Again, what's the point of the decoration on this building if this is indeed a high school? Ogden High School in the 1930s. And keep in mind, they said they completed this one in the mid-1930s during the Great Depression. So I guess the people of Utah were lucky in that they had jobs there. And once again, they were able to acquire all these materials and throw up this lavish building. Now, some other viewers have told me that in other cities they were messed up by the Great Depression, but it just seems to depend where you were. And they consider this Art Deco, even though this is mid-1930s. And look at the beauty of this auditorium. And remember, this is just a high school. And we saw some beautiful auditoriums in one of the high schools when we did the Detroit exploration. And we see that there's no issue out here in Utah. Now, what's going on in the 1930s? Well, we're told it's the Great Depression. We're told that people are suffering. People can't find jobs. Yet they were able to establish all this beauty and still adhere to the incredible aspects of the Art Deco style. Again, I believe this is a conflicting account, but a lot of people just accept what they're told. And you know what? That's your prerogative. If you want to believe whatever you're told, so be it. However, I'm not a person to just take what I'm told at face value because something doesn't seem to match with these accounts. And here we supposedly have an original construction photo or a layout photo of Ogden High School, yet there's something that seems strange about it. I guess it's nice that we can actually see clouds in the sky. That's a rarity. But why does this property just look like it's so open like this? And we'll be told, well, it's the classic construction photo. They had to have the means to get the blocks in there and build them. And yet it seems like it's always appeared that way from this aerial photo. So once again, who exactly knows what is going on with these buildings or what the true story is behind them? It always seems like when we look into the account a little bit more, we're posed with more questions and were posed with more conflicts in the mainstream account. I'm not even considering the previous civilization or anything like that. We go on to the Capitol Theater in Salt Lake City. This was constructed in 1913, a very auspicious or suspicious year in United States history, depending what your perception is. And I start with an interior photo because look at this beauty from 1913, supposedly. Unbelievable in terms of how it's laid out. And here's the front entrance. And on the outside, you still see a very decorative building. And I think of many of the opera houses and theaters that still endure to this day. And not just in the large cities like Salt Lake City, but even in the small towns, you'll still find opera houses, as though it was so important that they had entertainment. And we'll be told, well, it's because everything was spread out and, it was hard for people to get from point A to point B. Well, if it was hard to get from point A to point B, why was it easy to build these buildings? Why was it easier to build an opera house in your own town than it was to get in your horse and cart or your rudimentary automobile in the early 20th century and drive to a larger city? This reminds me of the one that we saw as we looked in earlier explorations because, again, you see the beauty in this entryway with the columns and the pillars and the arches. Once again, no detail spared. And this is just supposed to be a theater, and this is just supposed to be the entryway where people are milling about before they go in to actually watch the show. And yet I'm reminded of how much more gorgeous this is than many of our modern movie theaters or multiplexes. I mean, you can't wait to get out of the lobbyway. And I'll admit it's been a while since I've seen a movie because, frankly, there haven't been any movies since about a year or so that have compelled me to want to actually go. I think this would be enjoyable to see really any kind of show in, live performance or what have you, just by the beauty of the interior of this auditorium or this theater in and of itself. 1913, and they were able to put that kind of detail and that kind of beauty within it. It's just something that we don't see anymore. And yes, I know we've been over the excuses many times, but again, what's really going on with these buildings? And why is Salt Lake City something that stands out so much? Because of the compressed timeline that we're given, because of the origin story of settlement, which is much more compressed than other cities. It's one thing to say that they were able to build the Iowa State Capitol in the 1870s because Iowa had at least been settled and it had adjacent states that were settled. But here in Salt Lake City, we're out in the middle of nowhere. And we're still relatively isolated even in the early 20th century. And yet they were able to achieve this. And to a lot of people, there's nothing to question about this because, they're told what they're told and that's that. And the Capitol Theater still stands today and it's still beautiful today, inside and outside, from 1913. 110 years old. And these are the kind of hallmark buildings that, if you just accept aren't built anymore because of a lack of capability, then you'll pretty much accept whatever you're told. And we know there are a lot of people that like to accept what they're told. I understand. It's hard to ask questions. Now we go to the Salt Lake City County Building. So the official account on this one is that it was built between 1891 and 1894. So we have something that sort of links the completion of the construction of the temple to the construction of the beautiful state capitol and some of the other edifices that we looked at in the early 20th century. 1891 to 1894, supposedly built by Freemasons, and who knows exactly on the veracity of that account. In any event, it is a very gorgeous building, and it reflects some of the other county buildings that we've seen in the other cities. So once again, we see conflicting architectural styles, but then we see the same architectural styles. Logistically, wouldn't it be difficult to be able to do all these conflicting architectural styles in these cities if we're to believe the mainstream account? No, just don't ask, just accept it. Once again, very beautiful building, and of course you'll get the usual explanation for why the stone looks aged, and I suppose the rustication account makes sense with buildings if you want to believe that, but why would you do it for a bridge? Well, in any event, here is another very convincing construction photo. Interesting kind of cranes. I was almost kind of hoping to see the hamster wheel cranes again make an appearance as we saw in that painted picture in the Tower of Babel. But, I guess we do actually see some people working along the ground, although exactly what are they doing? And that's a rarity in these photos. And here you see the scaling with the columns once again, and that's always one of the construction techniques and hallmarks that I'm impressed by, is how they could achieve scaling with the columns, building them small, building them large, and yet always using as weight bearing with these incredible structures. Just a municipal building, and yet once again looking at the interior, we see that there's more to be told within the interior. Very beautiful floor, large archways, and just a lot of interior space. Looks like you could probably get 10 to 15 people shoulder to shoulder walking through that large entryway. Well, you need to have a very large building, especially for a municipal building. You can't have people going around and asking questions or being stuffed up when they're looking for their government services. That's why we build the modern buildings that way, right? And once again, when you look on the inside, you see just some of the details that really don't make any sense. Why are you bothering putting squares or circles on the walls or the arches? Why are there unique patterns within the floor? Why do you bother with these kind of decorations on the exterior of the building? Is its function not government, or is its function supposed to be something else? Well, just don't ask and just accept what you're told. Because if you ask questions, you're just going to ask more questions. And then people don't like people who ask questions because you're just supposed to accept what you're told. Again, another beautiful building. And I'm reminded probably of St. Louis a little bit and the City Hall in Milwaukee quite a bit as well. Again, you see some of the faces and some of the symbols that go around in these arched stone patterns that are constructed. And there's that beehive again. Now, if there was a previous civilization, could there have been different elements of it or different aspects of it? Absolutely. Some people want to dismiss that theory and maybe go with an alternative reality theory. I can consider both because right now I'm seeing evidence for both. And I think Salt Lake City is a prime example of different theories could apply. But what I can say is that if you just go off the mainstream account, you just dismiss everything as, well, it had to be true. It's the mainstream account. You're really sweeping a lot of things under the rug, and you're really accepting a lot of things that don't make sense. And perhaps that's more comfortable for you. And like I said, I understand. It's very disturbing to consider the fact that things aren't what we're told. It's very disturbing to consider the fact that our reality might not be what we think it is. Yet looking on the exterior of this building, little gargoyle figure there, very interesting, and yet you see some of the beautiful decorative detail in these columns. Now, granted, it looks like they're constructed modularly or in pieces, but, you know, it's not a carved gargoyle. It's obviously some sort of construction kit. And finally, we go to the Saltaire Palace, a beautiful resort that supposedly dates from the 1890s and has quite a history to it. The Saltaire Palace, right off of Salt Lake itself, just west of Salt Lake City. And there's been a lot of gorgeous pictures of this incredible palace. And there's many different variations of it. We see something that's very beautiful and doesn't really, once again, make a lot of sense for what's just supposed to be a resort in the 1890s west of Salt Lake City. And this is something else where I don't think there's an easy or simple explanation because we see pictures that show the glory and the detail of this building. And of course, you can always come up with the explanation, well, it was just made of temporary construction, it was stucco, it was balsa wood basically that just somehow happened to stand up to the mighty winds and the other elements of nature. Or once again, maybe, you know, nature was a lot more simple. The weather was always 50 to 70 degrees and there were no winds, and that's why the skies always look very vanilla and have no detail to them. Although I think we can see clouds in this photo, so I'll give a little credit where credit's due there. There's a lot of people milling about. It looks like it's a grand old time. Look at the detail, though, in the construction of this building. Again, you see the archway, and it looks like there's stones. Now, this building's long gone. You'll never guess how it disappeared. But I don't know if that's actually masonry work or if that really is some sort of facade. I don't know, and I'm going to admit that. Still, regardless of whether it was a temporary structure or a permanent structure, it did supposedly stand for many decades. We just don't know what the actual construction of it was, because unlike the other buildings we looked at, this building is not standing today. Yet there's something about it that invokes beauty in the imagination. And look at the coloring and the detail in this, and of course the large stairways, and we have a roller coaster. And I do have a video coming up that's going to posit some theories about what the other functions of roller coasters could have been, because you see that in Coney Island as well. Just a beautiful palace. And a beautiful resort that's really, at the time, just out in the middle of nowhere. Because remember, 1890s, how populated was Salt Lake City? Yes, we can look at the official population records, but how in the heck can you accept the fact that there was only just a couple hundred settlers who built all this in just a few short decades? I mean, maybe you want to accept that, and that's fine. But you see what this was, just an incredible, beautiful resort. And is it the remnant of something? Is it something from an alternative existence? Is it both? Yes, and you know, here I think they called this the Hippodrome, and just gorgeous and beautiful and just out in the middle of nowhere in 1890s, early 20th century. You could see though why this would be a real draw. And personally, I think this is something that's superior to current Disney World or Disneyland. Just my opinion, but I'm just talking about the architectural beauty of this building. And of course, there's a lot of specials you can find on the rise and fall of the Great Saltaire. Lost Lakefront Resort. And why was it lost? Well, we'll get to it in a second. But you have some other photos where you just see how incredibly beautiful this building was. And what was its original function is something that I wonder. Could this have been some sort of power plant? Could this have been something with processing the high salt content in the water? Could it have some other function? We're not really sure. Yet, why would you go to this length of effort to build something like this if it was intended to be a resort, regardless of whether the construction materials were temporary or permanent? Again, it's as though nobody had anything better to do. They didn't have to worry about survival. And this wonderful edifice was destroyed by a fire in the 1970s. And who knows on the veracity of that account, because we're always told how fires managed to destroy large masonry capitol buildings in other states, and multiple large masonry capitol buildings in other states. And here's the beauty that you'll find there today. Yes, this is definitely something that looks like temporary construction. Well, I hope you appreciated this exploration of Salt Lake City. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and thank you for joining me. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to be exploring the Hoover Dam. The exploration of the Hoover Dam is going to complete our initial look at the so-called Great American Monuments or Structures. We looked at the Statue of Liberty in the east, we looked at Mount Rushmore in the Midwest, or the West, depending on your perspective, and now we're going to look at the Hoover Dam in the west, or vicinity of the Mojave Desert, near Las Vegas. The Hoover Dam warrants our attention because of its construction timeline. We're going to look at specific details about it, but initially we're just going to take the glance of the Hoover Dam that many people do when they're on tourism in Nevada. When you look at the Hoover Dam, you see that this is a very impressive structure. Would you be surprised to know, though, that the Hoover Dam is actually considered an Art Deco construction? Of course, the other aspect about it is that it was built during the Great Depression, and right now we're simply relaying what is generally well known about the dam. We're also told that because of its tremendous power supply capabilities, it supplies power to Nevada, Arizona, but primarily California, which takes the majority of its power. It depends on what source you look at, and you'll get different accounts in terms of its actual power supply percentages to the states. Yes, no one ever would have thought that it would supply the great state of California, where they decided, so we're told, to build a city in the middle of a desert, that being Los Angeles. As we know, the Los Angeles basin is quite an arid area. Looking at some of the images, though, of the exterior and the interior, we see a tremendously impressive edifice. And indeed, the dam, and I'll try to resist the urge to make dam puns, so much for that. But the dam was designed to provide power, we're told, and it was built during the Great Depression. Yes, another tremendous construction achievement during the Great Depression, because as we know, the United States government, at least, still had unlimited financial resources to conduct whatever projects that it needed to conduct. And for many people, this is the simple explanation for why many of these wondrous edifices were completed on rather short timelines and during the Great Depression. It also explains why the United States was able to quickly shift its focus from the Great Depression to the industrialization of the Second World War by becoming the quote-unquote arsenal for democracy. Many of these images, though, show a very romantic, arid landscape, which the dam fills. And you can see that the bypass bridge that we started the video on gives you an idea of how easily you could miss this very impressive structure. Much as with many of the interstates would allow you to miss other wondrous old world structures such as the Iowa State Capitol or the Cathedral or Basilica in St. Paul and Minneapolis respectively, because you're speeding along on the highway and you don't bother to look right to actually see the dam, or left depending on which way you're going. I always found Lake Mead and the surrounding area in Nevada very impressive, though, because it seems to have more indications with its existence. The dam is extremely unique because of the fact that when it was completed, we're told it was one of the largest dams in the world, and we'll look at the official account after we look at these exterior images. But what are your thoughts when you glance on these exterior images of this Art Deco masterpiece from the 1930s? Yes, a dam that was constructed to be an Art Deco masterpiece. And here I show the different lighting on the dam, and when you consider how the sunlight changes and then you compare that with the artificial lighting that's provided, what kind of visuals does it give you of this impressive structure? And looking at the overall structure of the dam itself, and of course we all are told that this was all constructed with poured concrete, and we'll take a look at construction photos in a moment. It's very easy to realize, though, that this dam did cost many lives, and whether it was something that was constructed exactly as we're told, or it was something that may have had a little bit more to it than what we realize. And oddly enough, we'll even see that in the official account, which raises questions. It's an impressive structure, and the terrain is rather beautiful around it, at least when you're looking at it, although when you're actually there in Nevada or in the Mojave Desert, you can't help but notice how unrealistically dry it is. It's as though you're standing under a hot air dryer at all times. I'm always amazed at the ability that we had, or at least we're informed that we had, to lay out such a structure like this. And remember, it's not just the exterior, it's always the interior. And especially when we come to Art Deco buildings, we tend to get an idea of the size and immensity, but then also the fine detailing that went into constructing such an interior. And while the Art Deco aspects of the dam may not be readily visible just looking at the exterior, aside from some of the towers that we see that are in the reservoir area, when you look in the interior of the dam, it actually provides many different touches of Art Deco. So quite an intriguing structure overall. Intriguing in terms of its construction timeline, the wonderful visuals that you look at. And there's a reason I'm doing this video a little bit differently, because I believe to fully appreciate this particular structure, you have to see it in live action. And it will certainly give a comparison in terms of how large and give you an idea with the scale in terms of some of the other structures that we've looked at. It'll also make the official figures bounce out a little bit more. This is the bypass that they built, so you could just simply drive right past the dam without really looking at it. And of course, we're told that this is for security reasons. And indeed, it's also for security reasons that there are many areas of the dam that you can't access to this day, where you can see some of the Art Deco images that we will share later. Although, fortunately, we still have photographs, purportedly from within the dam, that will show this. Interestingly enough, this dam, we're told, was a long-term construction project, although actually pulling off the final construction of it didn't take long as you might think. There's always many different challenges that we don't realize when it comes to building a dam, and you consider what an engineering marvel that this is. The other thing I find surprising, look at that, U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Reclamation. Bureau of Reclamation? We have so many bureaus in our wonderful United States government. What a name, though. Bureau of Reclamation. What exactly are they reclaiming? Is it natural resources? Is it energy? Or is it something else? The dam has appeared in many other fictional accounts as well, even in that, well, less than stellar Transformers movie from the 2000s, where we're told that the dam was built to house the Allspark. Yes, it's very sad that I actually know that without referencing it. I myself prefer the original animated Transformers movie from the mid-1980s, but I'm sure you'll find that is no surprise. Back to the Hoover Dam, though, you can see it in different visuals just how complex the layout of it was. What kind of structural detailing and preparation of the terrain did they have to do? How much digging and excavation needed to be completed before they could actually begin to pour concrete, according to the official account? And what exactly was the whole purpose behind it? Of course, we'll be told that during the Great Depression they needed to provide jobs, and that seems sensible enough on the surface, but why exactly were they not building dams in every state? We certainly had rivers in every state. Why is it they didn't find any good dam site in every state across the Union and simply construct a dam? Imagine how many jobs you would have created, and we're also told that the Hoover Dam has paid for itself over time, so you could achieve that in other states as well. Let's take a look at what our friends at the Bureau of Reclamation tell us about the Hoover Dam and the official facts that we have. Again, such an interesting name, Bureau of Reclamation. You think they'd call it the Bureau of Dams or something like that. So the Hoover Dam, where is it? Black Canyon, spinning the Colorado River between Arizona and Nevada. And yes, I say spinning rather than spanning because it does seem to be spinning. About 30 miles southeast of Las Vegas, Nevada. How tall is it? 726 feet from foundation rock to the roadway. The towers and ornaments on the parapet rise 40 feet above the crest. Amazing that they know exactly how much it weighs. 6,600,000 tons. What kind of dam is it? A concrete arch gravity type. Very intriguing. Also, they don't mention that it's an Art Deco styling, but we'll see that in a little bit. What's the maximum water pressure at the base of the dam? 45,000 pounds per square foot. Very impressive. I'm always reminded of the transparent aluminum that they used in Star Trek IV to solve the problem of building a whale tank on the captured Klingon bird of prey. Yes, I slipped in a Star Trek reference. How much concrete is in the dam? 3.25 million cubic yards. Now here's where it gets intriguing. The first concrete for the dam was placed June 6, 1933, and the last on May 29, 1935, so really not all that long to construct it, just shy of 2 years. Approximately 160,000 cubic yards of concrete were placed in the dam per month. Very impressive achievement. How much cement was required? Now, here's where it gets really interesting. More than 5 million barrels. The daily demand during construction of the dam was from 7,500 to 10,800 barrels. Reclamation had used only 5,862,000 barrels in its 27 years of construction activity preceding June 30th, 1932. Wait a minute. What exactly are they saying here? That there was construction that was going on prior to 1932? I mean, that's what this sentence seems to indicate to me. What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments. And I'm willing to accept second and third hand sources of information for this particular exploration. If you have a grandfather or relative who worked on this dam, let me know. Well, it's really the story behind this. Reclamation had used only 5 million barrels in the 27 years of construction activity preceding June 30th, 1932. Once again, it seems like we have a conflicting account here. What was an unusual feature of the Hoover Dam's construction? The dam was built in vertical columns of blocks, and we see an image of it over here, that varied in size from about 60 feet square at the upstream face of the dam to about 25 feet square at the downstream face. An estimated 215 blocks make up the dam. So very impressive, and yet in most of the images we have many other questions that we would ask. What were the principal items of work? More than 5,500,000 cubic yards of material were excavated, and another 1 million cubic yards of earth and rock fill placed. By feature, this included excavation. So we have 1.5 million cubic yards for the diversion tunnels. For the foundation of the dam, 1.7 million cubic yards. For spillways and incline tunnels, 750,000 cubic yards. So we're moving a lot of dirt here. Well, perhaps they just should have called the good people of Seattle, since they had a lot of experience with regrading and moving hills, and the good people of Boston, who were able to do it long before heavy machinery was even invented. What were the qualities of principal materials used in the dam? The principal materials, we have reinforcement steel, 45 million pounds, gates and valves, 21 million pounds, plate steel and outlet pipes, 88 million pounds. Just throwing these numbers about this infinite amount of material as though it was really no issue, and perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps during the Great Depression, they had great logistical planning. They just had some rather questionable aspects about how they documented this, especially in the fact that we have no chronological record of photos. What construction work was necessary before operations started at the dam site? Again, they constructed Boulder City to house both government and contractor employees. Well, why not? You need to build a city before you can build a dam, and you can go to Boulder City to this day. We've got a really nice breakfast cafe there. Construction of 7 miles of 22-foot wide asphalt surfaced highway. So build a city, build a highway. Easy. Construction of a 222-mile-long power transmission line from San Bernardino, California, which it should be noted, Southern California is the main target of the power that this dam produces, to the dam site to supply energy for construction, and then ultimately to supply energy to Southern California. That still needs it to this day. At least that's what we're told officially. Well, let's take a look at some of the images that we have of the dam construction in the interior. The images that we see show a very tremendous and impressive layout with a large volume of space, and indeed this does conform with the report that we had with the amount of excavated material. Yet these images paint many different pictures and perceptions that we could have of the construction of this very impressive edifice. Now, as I said earlier, there's no doubt that many lives were lost in either the construction or perhaps the reestablishment of this particular dam. Or perhaps I should use the word reclamation. Why, again, is it the Bureau of Reclamation? And isn't it intriguing that we even have a Bureau of Reclamation? I mean, if it's supposed to be about the conservation of natural resources, call it the Bureau of Conservation of Natural Resources. It's also odd to me that once again we don't have a very well chronologically ordered account of the construction of this impressive edifice. Once again, we're to believe that we had the ability to plan out and execute the construction of this very complicated dam, and yet for whatever reason, we could not properly organize a true, well-documented account, where we have images, video, and everything that's in chronological order. I mean, I can certainly say that one of my favorite examples, the 801 Grand Building in Des Moines, Iowa, can actually find time-lapse video that shows it being constructed over 2 years. I also saw it, so it's not to say that I don't believe that we could have constructed this particular edifice. I just find the account very problematic. And maybe we could just say that's because of limitations in the records, or it goes down to that old conflicted account that, yes, we don't want to disrespect our ancestors in the past because they could achieve these great things. They just didn't document them very well. We hadn't figured out the internet yet. We didn't have the ability to store and archive records. We had them moved from one building to the next, and then, of course, those buildings tended to burn down for various reasons unknown, or somebody dropping a cigarette or being irresponsible in the basement of said building. We do see in the images, though, some of the heavy equipment that was used in the construction, reclamation of the dam, as we'll say. And it does give us clues, though, that there was a lot of effort that was put into this. And as I said, I had no doubt that there were lives that were lost in this effort. Now, I'm certainly welcoming any of you to share the information that you have about the Hoover Dam in the comments. Once again, it's another project that occurred during the Great Depression. And of course, the governments always have money no matter what the economic situation is. And of course, that's never questionable because, as we know, in most of the government establishment charters across the land, they have the ability to simply create finances or supposedly direct them. Now, we're not going to get into a complicated assessment of money. We're simply talking about the proposed difficulty of the financial situation. We're also told that this dam was a long considered project in the state of Nevada. And yet at the same time, they decide to actually execute it. And by the way, they built this during the same time frame that they were building Mount Rushmore in South Dakota during a time of greatest economic hardship in the nation's history. Indeed, this image here shows us how they supposedly poured the concrete in these large cavern areas or these large blocks that they built with framework. Isn't it interesting, though, how that always seems to be the account? They build these large blocks, they frame them, and then they pour the concrete in them. I'm not questioning that. I'm merely saying that seems to be a very well-known and used technique of construction. And it does make a lot of sense from many different perspectives. Do you see any issues with some of the images that we're looking at? Is there anything questionable, or does it seem to line up? Again, the biggest point of concern that I have is just the fact that we don't have a nice, well-ordered chronological account. Perhaps there's one out there. I was almost expecting to see on the Bureau of Reclamation site a simple video with images and actual video because, we did have the ability to take video in the 1930s, even the early 1930s, that would document this colossal project. You would think that the completion of this dam would certainly be national news. We're told that it was. But would the people who were suffering the effects of the Great Depression, who were working the fields in California, since many of them came from the Midwest during the Dust Bowl, I'd even received a question in terms of how accurate I think the Dust Bowl was. Well, the Dust Bowl is probably what we're told it was, but the causes behind it are certainly up for debate. There's the great man himself, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, pointing at the dam and being assisted by his aide because, as we know, he was confined to a wheelchair. But yet, through the good use of photography and video, a lot of people aren't even aware of that little historical fact. Is it a historical fact? I don't know. It's safe to say, though, that Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president 4 times, and no one else has shared or will ever share that distinction in the United States. Here's the construction of the bypass bridge. Again, we're told that the whole reason that this occurred was for security purposes. We also have the wonderful account of all the individuals who came to work on this dam out in the middle of the desert, and I'm always intrigued by the fact that we have all these accounts of these wondrous engineering projects that just happen to really be out in the middle of nowhere. And everyone will tell you that the Mojave is the middle of nowhere. There's a reason why there's some of the largest United States military bases that just happen to be west of Las Vegas in the Mojave. And you'll have the major branches represented, minus the Coast Guard, of course, but who knows? There could be a Coast Guard station on Mono Lake way up there in California. I'll stop joking. The thing about the images, though, is we do get an idea of the colossal effort of construction that went into this. We also see some of the machinery that was available and the heavy machinery that was available. What I find intriguing about that is we consider the amazing buildings that we had built, name any state capitol that was built in the 1800s, whichever one that we've looked at in the past, and you have to compare and contrast that with this construction of the dam. The other aspect of the Hoover Dam that I find interesting, isn't this nice? All these dignitaries riding around here in this particular piece of construction. Yes, isn't it a fine time to be riding around looking at this marvelous dam? We do have some intriguing plans of the dam, although I have to say some of the schematics that we have seem to create more questions. There are some very fine details with it, And yet, in other aspects, there seem to be things that are hand-waved. And of course, the reason we'll get for that again is security concerns. This is a major piece of infrastructure. This is critical to power supplies for the southwestern United States, and nobody debates that. And yet, at the same time, there's so many questionable accounts with this particular dam. And you can see that with the effort of construction that went into it, it would make a little bit of sense, especially in the 1930s, that if there was something out there that they decided to reclaim, perhaps that would be the time to do it. And indeed, it seems as though the 1930s really was a time of reclamation. So perhaps this Bureau of Reclamation could have been more active than we truly realized, in addition to all the other wondrous government programs that were going on during the 1930s, which we're told were essential for our survival. And if you were an individual who questioned these particular government programs, well, you tend to be ostracized in any manner of ways, whether you're a military officer or you were involved with a corporation, a politician, or in any way, shape, or form. It seems as though they did a very good job of creating a consensus in the 1930s, despite the economic hardships. Some of the other images that we have, though, show the cavernous construction and all the amount of material that was allegedly being moved. Of course, we can always say that many of these images, are we really sure that this is from the exact site that we're looking at? I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying, how can we absolutely verify unless we were really there? The interesting images that we have, though, that show the fine-tuned construction of the dam itself always create more questions with how they actually poured the concrete. I would certainly love to see some more photographs that show the actual pouring of the concrete. We're told that was a very arduous process, and indeed that's where many of the individuals who unfortunately lost their lives in the construction or reclamation of this dam, where that happened. Now let's transition to look at some of the interior images, and remember, we're told that this dam is Art Deco, although a lot of people aren't aware of that, and I certainly had no idea that the Hoover Dam was actually Art Deco. Yet you have these interesting, almost, dare I say, angelic figures that greet you when you arrive at the dam. We're told that there was some sculptor that was involved in this, but once again, these seem to line up with what we think of as Art Deco. You also consider the numerous accounts of how this dam appears in many different video game franchises in the aforementioned Transformers franchise. It is a very well-known landmark. And yet, not many people are aware of the fact that on the inside you have some very intriguing symbols, which always seems to accompany anything that we see that's labeled as Art Deco construction. Yet, oddly enough, the symbols aren't traditionally what we think of as the classic American symbols. Just getting an idea, though, of the size and scope of these generators. And we also have to look at other dams, because we did come across the Keokuk power plant back in Iowa, which at the time was the largest dam. And here's an example of one of the initial symbols. Very odd. This is not exactly a symbol that we consider representative of the United States. You would think, this being the 1930s and everything being under such hardship with the Great Depression, we'd want to have some more recognizable American symbols. You know, the wings of liberty that never lose a feather. And instead we have this very interesting, I don't know, dare I say, diamond or unique design. We also have these strange angelic figures. I mean, are these to represent the spirit of America persevering during the times of economic hardship with the Great Depression? Turn to the government, the New Deal will save you. I mean, is that what it's supposed to represent? Very odd, very strange, because these aren't symbols that we tend to see in other locations unless we're looking at Art Deco. The other interesting aspect about some of the symbols that you see, such as this one, is that while it seems to be on a very well built, is this a granite floor? Is this the concrete? Not sure. Is this some other advanced polymer? I don't know. You can't access a lot of these symbols because, as we said, a lot of portions of the dam are closed off. Just looking at some of the scale, though, of the interior construction, and once again, I know you're going to be surprised, we have virtually no images that show the interior construction. You just really don't need to see those, because if you have exterior photos, you can simply assume that everything went off on the inside. That seems to be a recurring theme that we have in these explorations. The other dizzying aspect with looking at the interior of the dam is you see some of the complexities. Now, some people may say that we have interior construction photos. Wait a minute. What is that? Is that the glaive there from Kroll with a big maze or labyrinth around it? And we can get some of the impressions of the Art Deco construction with the unique symbols. And indeed, in other reliefs that you see across the dam, you'll see the usual array of symbols that don't tend to make a lot of sense, at least from our direct perspective. Look at that, the power individual there, flexing the muscles. And once again, we have another idealized human individual depicted here. They died to make the desert bloom. Well, maybe it should say, they died to make Southern California bloom. And I don't say that with any sort of disregard for the needs of the individuals in Southern California. It's just intriguing to me that we have this dam in Nevada, but it supplies power to all the Southwest. And again, I'm asking, why not just build more dams in the other states? They could have created more jobs, and then the dams could have paid for themselves by the power that they produced. But I don't know. It's just a question for me. You know, I'm not in government. I'm not a politician, and I'm certainly not representing any corporate interest. But look again at the elevator here, and we see this same Art Deco. And that's the aspect that you'll tend to miss if you don't really get on the inside of the dam. And it's challenging to look at the inside of the dam because of security concerns. We have these large caverns and passageways, and we also mix this with the symbols that we see that paint a different picture than what our initial impressions might be of the dam. For example, here we have a sprocket with a very intriguing symbol all around it. Now, of course, we have the usual artwork explanation behind this, and that was the very crux of Art Deco, or so we're told. There's also the aspect that a lot of these symbols are still in the dam, but you can't actually access it. You can only access it in one of the tourism-only areas. Very interesting. So is that really what's in the dam, or is that just what we're being shown that we're supposed to believe is there? Whatever the case, these symbols are very unique, and they seem to give a different account than what initial impressions would give of the dam. And if you ever get to travel to visit the Hoover Dam in person, and I recommend it even with the arid climate of southern Nevada and southern California, you'll find that you'll have many more questions. Even just looking at the exterior of the dam from any perspective, it creates many more questions. Because it goes back to the question of if we were capable of doing this during the greatest time of economic hardship in the United States history, why didn't we build more dams? In fact, why aren't we building more dams now? We're told that the United States economy has done exceptionally well despite the challenges of the early 2020s. And now that the United States economy has recovered and we're told that we have power shortfalls, we have infrastructure shortfalls, why don't we just simply build more dams? We could create more jobs. We could even put really cool symbols all over the dams and cause other questions. But for some unknown reason, we just don't do this. And there's a variety of explanations for why we don't. We don't have the political will to do it. We just don't desire to do it. We have too many safety standards, or we have other expenses that we have to attend to. I won't even say anything about the conflicts that we're supporting, whether it's materially or financially, or in all cases both, as it tends to be. But how was it that during the time of greatest economic hardship the United States has ever faced, it managed to complete, in a very short amount of time, an impressive work of infrastructure? An impressive work of infrastructure with wondrous and inspiring Art Deco decorations, maybe that's what Art Deco really is, Deco decorations, inside and outside of the Hoover Dam. What are your thoughts of the Hoover Dam? And by all means, let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're exploring Seattle, the Emerald Old World City. We head to the Pacific Northwest to partake in the beauty of this wonderful area. And Seattle's called the Emerald City because of the lush greenery of the forest around the area. Although, if you ever fly a UAV over Seattle and you're trying to get a good view of Mount Rainier in the distance with the cityscape, good luck. It's not exactly the easiest thing to pull off. I remember when I first went to Seattle many decades ago and I was told, enjoy that view of Mount Rainier while you have it because you're never going to see it again. And that statement was quite correct because I believe it was 87 days before I saw Mount Rainier again. Seattle's well known for being an area with a lot of rain. It's considered a rainforest even by some. Looking at our Seattle map of 1891 and our classic bird's eye view map, we have another one of these cities that was founded after 1850, so we could really say this is one of these super cities, at least according to the mainstream historical account. The Denny Party was considered the first settlement party, and they didn't arrive until the 1850s. And remember, the United States was still growing and did not expand westward contiguously until a few years after Seattle was quote-unquote founded. But when we look at the bird's eye view, we see a very well-developed port city, which is what we would expect. And we have different indications of large buildings that were in existence. Although what we're told is that prior to 1889, most of these buildings were wooden buildings. And then, after, you'll never guess it, a little fire occurred in 1889. Although when we actually look at the historical account of Seattle and those images, we may find that they tell us a different story than what the mainstream account tells us about the composition of the buildings. So, Seattle was affiliated originally with logging, but then it was also a major waypoint for the Klondike Gold Rush in the 1890s, and that's supposedly where all the population came from. Yes, many people were told to follow the gold, do as you're told and go to the gold, and many did, and many suffered and struggled to go through Seattle and struggled through the harsh landscapes of Alaska. For some unknown reason, perhaps because of logistical difficulties, which is what the mainstream account admits, there were never any large cities that grew up in Alaska. Instead, it's all empty, but it does explain the rapid growth of Seattle. And indeed, one of the first indicators we have of Seattle is the population growth. 1860, 188, 1920, 315,000. A growth of 167,000% in just 60 years. Now remember, New York City took 100 years to grow 5,000%. The United States took 100 years to grow over 1,000%. And it came to me, well, if it could grow that fast in 60 years, what did it look like from 1860 to 1960, or 100 years? 188 in 1860, 557,000 in 1960, a growth of 296,000% over 100 years for a single city in the United States. A United States that in a 100-year period of massive population growth never came close to this percentage increase. And I have to ask, how extreme does this number have to be before anybody even begins to ask any questions about it? 1,000,000%? 1,000,000,000%? What if we did it with the world? The world population of 1.2 billion in 1860, if it had a growth that Seattle did during the same period of 296,000%, then in 1960 we would have 3.5 trillion with a T people. Now, the actual 1960 population in the world, or the land, or whatever you want to call it, is 3 billion. Just imagine that, 3 trillion people, if the rest of the land had the same growth rate that Seattle. Now let's take a look at some images of Seattle from 1800 to early 1900. And we do have some images that we're told are from 1870, such as these images, and this gives us the view that we'd expect to see. Very new settlement, some wooden buildings, and a lot of dirt all over the roads. Here in this nice assembly of pictures of the schools, and yet we see some very well-built schools with some more intricate designs to them. B.F. Day School looks pretty nice, and then here at the top we have Denny School. Nice little cupola there. I wonder what became of Denny School. And here we have President Garfield's memorial service, and we know this must be 1881 because that's when President Garfield was unfortunately assassinated. You might recall that we looked at his great monument that still exists to this day in Cleveland that stands out a little bit. But again, in this image, we see wooden houses and large hills. And then, of course, we see other images within Seattle, and this is one of the earliest ones from the 1860s. And oddly enough, it seems to be a very well-built structure here, but do these images really tell us anything, or are they just really there to give us the perception of something? Here in 1880, in this image showing us a little bit of the bay and the port, and then we see many wooden houses. And I make note of that because what we're told by the official account is that prior to 1889 in Seattle, most of the structures were made out of wood. And yet we have other images, such as the bank here, which tell a different story. Unless we're to believe that this is some sort of wood that's covered with some sort of concrete appearing resin that someone just sprayed over it, or it's all a stucco building. We'll see this particular building here in the future. We also have images that show us that they're moving houses. Is that really what's happening here, or are these houses just elevated on what look to be pallets or crates for some unknown reason? I'd love to see a picture where they're actually moving them and how they're really doing it. That would be quite intriguing to me. And here we have the Occidental Hotel, one of the known landmarks in Seattle. It would subsequently become the Seattle Hotel after Seattle would undergo its trials and tribulations. What I always found funny, though, about the whole concept with the Klondike Gold Rush is that how so many unfortunate individuals went north to strike it rich, but yet none of the robber barons ever wanted to seem to put effort into that, even though there was gold up there. I wonder why. In this image, we see a tent city, but then if you look to the right, you see some very well-constructed banisters that look like they've been there for a while. They certainly don't look to be made of wood to me. And then we've explored trolleys recently, and here we have a trolley in Seattle in the mid-1880s, according to the image, and it's being pulled by a horse because, why actually have horse wagons when you could build tracks and then build trolleys with wheels on them and have horses pull them? Well, that's a very well-constructed building there, and that does not appear to be made of wood, and I simply call that out because this image was from before 1889. And we have other images from the 1880s, 1890s, which again tell a different story than what we're given about Seattle. The images show us that there are many buildings and structures that do not appear to be made of wood, and we have a lot of mud on the train tracks as well. Well, that's easily explainable. Regrading Seattle, leveling hills, 1900 to 1930, the largest effort at the time. We are told that Seattle had to be regraded. There were many hills, and in order to make the city more hospitable and more capable to bear buildings, they had to level hills, and this was a massive regrading project or excavation project. Now, again, we're told that Seattle attempted this prior to 1900, but they weren't very successful. I guess they just didn't have the wherewithal and the desire to do it that Boston did, because Boston managed to regrade hills long before they had heavy machinery. Looking at these images, though, we see once again that they seem to tell us a different perspective, that perhaps it almost seems as though some of the buildings are being dug out or having dirt removed from them. These are just very strange images, and they could be taken in a variety of different ways. Now, why would you start regrading things that already had structures on them? Indeed, the official account tells us that many of the great structures had to be torn down so the city can be regraded. Also, it should be worthy to note that heavy machinery was still in its infancy at the time, and yet there were many tremendous accomplishments from 1900 to 1910. Just imagine a regrading or excavation project like this happening now. Even though, as we know, heavy machinery has advanced, hydraulics has advanced since the early 1900s. And yet, for some reason, they wanted to level all these hills and then remove all these wondrous structures that happen to sit upon these hills for various reasons. It just paints a conflicting account, and yet it's another one that we have. And indeed, we see Denny Hill here and how it was leveled by as early as 1908 for wondrous buildings. Washington Hotel and Denny Hill before the regrade and then after. And yet there's other images from this regrade that just show a tremendous amount of soil and dirt just being moved. Although we don't actually see it being moved, here it looks like we've got a hose. Are they just spraying the dirt away with the hose? How much pressure and how much effort would that take? And truth be told, I really don't know what's going on with these images, and I don't know what the actual chronology of these images is. I'm simply sharing what's on the official account with you and allowing you to make your own distinctions about this, because it's really hard to say. Oddly enough, we only ever see one digger in any of these images, and yet we're to believe that in a short amount of time, 2 years in some cases, they managed to move a tremendous amount of dirt. Now, how long would that take using modern equipment and implements? And here we have Denny School, and it was demolished as part of the regrading in 1929. Remember when we saw this earlier, the beautiful school with the nice cupola on it. Looks like it even has borderline pediments on the roof. It may have been made of wood, but who knows for sure. It's hard to ascertain from this particular image. And we had the Great Seattle Fire. This was a glue pot fire that occurred in 1889. Yes, I think this is one of my new favorite stories, because remember how we had our pigeon cigarette story from Indianapolis, where here we have an overturned glue pot that in 20 minutes caused a massive conflagration in all of Seattle. Yes, another great fire. The fire was so hot that it melted these plates. And indeed, the account of this is that a worker in a shop kicked over a glue pot, and suddenly it just started a fire. Was this a glue pot, or were they playing with wildfire? And indeed, in some of these images, right after the fire, we can see that these structures are clearly not made of wood, and we'll be told, well, they learned their lesson, that these structures that were not made of wood would survive the fire. Although, were these structures actually in the fire? And you'll see in a moment that other images show us that these structures were made out of concrete and bricks and blocks. And that's what's very clear in this, unless we want to believe that these are wood that's been spray painted or covered with some sort of resin or stucco, and it's made to look like concrete, but I don't believe that for a second. And indeed, in many of the images that we have a conflicting account where it appears that many of the buildings were actually made of stone and concrete. Now, certain individuals will tell us it's because they had a wooden frame. Yes, they have a wooden frame, and that's the explanation for it. Well, when you look at this particular structure here, are you really going to say that a wooden frame accounts for all this fine rubbling all over the place? That the walls that you see that are still standing were not made of the wooden frame, but the entryway was made of the wooden frame, and then when the fire burned the wooden frame, then it caused the rubbling? It's again one of those things that just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, could it be that the images were cherry-picked? Could it be that we can only go off of the images that we have? That's all true. I'm always amazed, though, at the amount of posing and, dare I say, lollygagging that we see in these images, because these were all taken either during or after the Great Seattle Fire of 1889. And yet here it looks like we can actually see a hose fighting the fire, so don't tell me that excuse that they didn't have the ability to fight fires then. They did have organized fire departments. Yes, they had horsepower that pulled the fire engines, but they did have them. And yet another interesting image where it seems like while there's a terrifying fire going on, everyone's just sort of standing around here in this image and gawking or staring at it. Ooh, look, fire. How terrible. Well, that's okay. We can rebuild the city really quickly. And yet we're to believe this level of destruction occurred? Oh, by the way, this fire produced virtually no human casualties. We're told that there was maybe one death that occurred from this terrifying fire that leveled a lot of the city, although how much of the city was actually leveled by it is also a conflicting account. So, yet here we see some very well-constructed buildings, and are we to believe that this building here that we're looking at is made out of wood? Yes, I don't really believe it myself. You have all the adornments on the windows and the multiple roof lines, different chimneys, and what do we have here? Look at where these windows are. Little slant construction going on there. I understand, though, it makes sense to build windows like that in the ground. For a variety of reasons. You might want to look out of the basement and see what's going on street level. But many of these other images, though, you can tell that these structures are clearly not wood, that there's no wood frame involved in this, that these were clearly concrete or some other material in these structures, and yet, once again, we have this odd image of individuals just posing with this destroyed building as though they look proud. Was this the fire department? Yes, we managed to stop the fire. We're a little late to the game, though. Then you have this individual who seems to be posing with his knee held out. Imagine the photographer telling him, stick your knee out a little bit more. You'll look a little cooler for the photo. And that's always something that we have when we look at these fire photos. There always seems to be individuals that are just moseying around afterwards, and then they're posing for their great pictures. Why is it always after the fact that they're doing this? And once again, though, we look at the structures that remain, and are we to believe that this wall and these sections of wall with these very odd cuts in them, at least that's what it looks like to me, managed to stand because, well, this was all concrete, but the rest of the structure was made of wood framing and it all burned down? I just find that a little hard to believe. Hey, check that out. We actually have a trolley here in 1889 that's not being pulled by a horse. So it looks like it didn't take Seattle very long to get their trolleys operational, or should I say to innovate and implement the fully run trolley by electric power and not horsepower. And yet here in these other images we see these strange remnants of buildings. Now, what are your thoughts on this? Do you believe that it was simply because they have wooden frames and that's why so many of these buildings were destroyed? Or is there some other explanation behind this? Are we really even seeing the results of the fire? Or is this something else that happened? Is there some other account where the fire department or some nearby United States military unit showed up and decided to create a bunch of fire breaks, and they did so with the tried and true technique of dynamite, and that's how we explain all the rubble? Indeed, I don't wonder as more questions are asked and more images become available if there is another account from that, because I can think of multiple cities where that's the actual account for why we have the destruction that we do. It's not the actual fire that destroyed most of the buildings, it was the authorities and their efforts to try to prevent the fire from spreading. And yet we have no shortage of images that show us tremendous amounts of rubbling all over the place. So what was it? Was it because the buildings were wood? Was it because fire breaks needed to be created and the commander on scene went a little overboard and decided to destroy everything? Some of these images are really strange. I mean, this image almost looks like it was exposed to radiation. Radiation, you follow me? Or it's just completely changed the nature of the image, or perhaps it was just overexposed. Whatever the case may be, though, these images tell us many different conflicting accounts. We're also informed that the same people who built these incredible structures are responsible for these negligent great fires that occurred in just about every city across the United States. So respect them, appreciate them for their capability to build the buildings, but don't disrespect them for the fact that these fires kept happening. And indeed, in that previous image, we saw that most of that structure seemed to endure except for the roof. And here we go with yet another trolley that seems to be operational on its own and doesn't need any horse to be pulling it. And again, this is only 5 years after the 1884 image that showed us the horse-pulled trolley. Here we have the docks, and they seem to have undergone tremendous damage from this glue pot fire, or this wildfire that Tyrion and Bronn inadvertently kicked over while they were looking at it during their little visit to Seattle in 1889. It's just very strange, though, that you have these kind of images where you see that the wharf and the dock are completely destroyed, and that makes sense, but then you have other images that show that buildings like this have been completely reduced to rubble. So what's the real explanation? What's going on in these images? And I certainly invite you to let me know what you think in the comments, and all perspectives are welcome here. And again, I just can't get over how often we see people just posing. I mean, I know they're taking pictures, but this is after a horrific disaster occurred. Now, I'm sure everybody was dancing around happy. Well, only one person may have died, we're not sure, but there's a lot of property damage. And then here in this other image, we actually see that there is a functional fire department attempting to fight the fire with hoses. Now, the official account says that the fire spread so fast, 20 minutes after the quote-unquote glue pot was kicked over, there was so much smoke the firefighting team didn't know where to focus their efforts. And as a result, the fire spread quickly. Then you have other images of buildings such as this with the slant construction again, and yet this is very clearly not made of wood. Once again, we have many great electrical poles all over the place. But then you can see what happened to some of these structures that were clearly not made of wood, and yet they seem to have been utterly eviscerated. Was it by the fire? Was it by the authorities coming in with dynamite to try to create fire breaks? None of it makes any sense. This is the Hotel Seattle, and this is the hotel that ultimately replaced the Occidental Hotel earlier, and it has the same sort of construction where it's built in the block, and we're always reminded of the Flatiron buildings that we've seen in our other city explorations. Well, I guess it's only fitting that Seattle have one too. And here's a subsequent image of it. And look at the development on this block, at least what we're told is development, and oddly enough, once again, we can see signs of more advanced construction. So it seems clear that this hotel was always going to be a wondrous building, although what's the true account behind it? And here we can see that Seattle grew quickly in the 1900s, and we recall our earlier population growth of over 200,000% in 100 years, which is very impressive. Of course, this is when Seattle was a beautiful city, and now it is the fastest growing large city in the United States from 2010 to 2020. Looking at other images, though, we can still see the remains of hills, so it would have been wonderful if they would have spent some effort actually documenting the regrading project. And yet we see other wondrous buildings that are certainly not wood. And here's our first look at Smith Tower that we'll be taking a closer look at here in a moment. But it gives us the impression that there was much more to Seattle than meets the eye. And perhaps there's a much more complex account than we'd like to realize. Compare and contrast this image, which we're told is from the early 1900s, with the earlier image that we saw of Seattle in 1880, where we could clearly see the port and the facility, how the houses were constructed, and how well maintained all the lawns were. Let's take a closer look at Smith Tower, built 1911 and 1914. It was the tallest in Seattle until 1962, with the construction of the very hilariously named Space Needle. And here we see one of these wondrous early 1900s buildings, and whatever architecture style you want to go with, take your pick, because I'm not going to bother going along with the name of it, because this is a very, very unique building. This does give me reminders, though, of Singer Tower for some reason. And it's very intriguing to think that this was the tallest building west of the Mississippi for quite some time. We're told that the lower floors are made out of concrete, and then they use the catch-all term for the upper floors that it's clad in terracotta. Ah, yes, good old terracotta. Now, who knows what that material really is? It's probably unidentified material, so we'll just call it terracotta. It's one of those catch-all terms, much like concrete tends to be in certain applications. Remember the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa? I'm getting a similar feeling with this building. Now, in full disclosure, I have not visited this building in person, and yet we have inclinations of more advanced construction materials when we look at the exterior of this building. Indeed, when you look at the actual tower, and we're looking towards the very top of the building, and we have the hint that this is not just some simple construction material, that there's something a little bit more advanced to it. And indeed, thinking of the fact that this building is now 110 years old, and we're told that they only ever had to clean the exterior of it once. Well, let's take a look at our well-documented and very convincing construction photos. And of course, this shows us that, yes, it does actually have steel bones, and then they covered the exterior of it, because that's how we built buildings like that back then. I see no issues with any of these images, and believe it or not, there's even a penthouse now in the very tower of this Smith Tower. Or excuse me, there's a penthouse at the very top of this Smith Tower. So very interesting, and again, you see the different designs with the windows and the more complicated arches and tight geometry. Now let's look at the interior of the building, something I always like to do. And What exactly is the interior of this building really made out of? Is this some sort of granite? Is this a marble? Is this a combination? On first look, this just appears to be a marble. My efforts to try to ascertain exactly what the interior is constructed out of met with, well, let's just say some erroneous information. So if you've actually been there, or if you live in Seattle, let me know. What do you think the interior of this Smith Tower is really constructed of? And here we have signs of more advanced construction with several facial figures that were told are Native Americans or whoever they want to say they are for the day. And yet we also see other inclinations of more advanced construction on the interior. And really, I think that's the most important thing. That's something we tend to gloss over when we do these explorations, is we don't consider that the real story of the buildings is the interior. And indeed, while it is quote-unquote well documented with many photos of the exterior construction, we never see photos of the interior construction, because who would actually want to see how they got all that marble, whether it's the Smith Tower or any state capitol building that we've explored, in the building? And we certainly wouldn't want to see how they built columns in there. That's just boring. We have well-documented images that are not very questionable, and that should answer all your questions that yes, this building was built, and it was very easily built. And as long as you ask no more questions, then you will be satisfied. Yet, again, consider what the actual layout of the building is, and if you can really go visit the building and look at the interior, let me know. Do you think that what you actually see on the interior matches what the interior is supposed to look like based on these construction photos? Now again, I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just asking you to make a comparison. Do it on your own and tell me what you think, for those of you who are in and around the Seattle area or going there. And once again, I'm reminded of Singer Tower. This is a very impressive design, and here we have another postcard. I suppose we could add postcard to wedding venue as one of our indicators of an old world building. I also really like this close-up of this elevator apparatus that we have within the Smith Tower. Very intriguing to think of the concept of older elevators and how they functioned and why there seemed to be an ability for them to function so well. Ah, look at this interesting image, the very elusive photo of Mount Rainier in the distance of Seattle. Looks to be very detailed. This is a very interesting image, and the fact that we can see Mount Rainier so well in clouds that are lit so well. What do you make of it? Here, though, in this more modern image, we can get an idea of the elevator doors, and they appear to be brass, but I'm not on the ground, so I can't make a direct assessment. And then the various walls, and I'm always reminded of how in our more modern buildings we have walls that appear like this, such as in the 801 Grand building in Des Moines, Iowa, and yet we know that the materials are not nearly as solid and have a rather hollow sound to them when you knock on them. In the more modern buildings, that is. There's a variety of rooms in the Smith Tower, and it seems as though this building has a much more intricate history than we're led to believe. Just looking at the banks of the elevators, though, and analyzing the construction materials, we can see that there's a much older account than we might like to think with this particular building, rather than just hand-waving 1911 and 1914, because remember, all the interiors were done within 3 years as well. 3 years construction timeline. And keep in mind that while this is going on, they were also furiously busy regrading the city of Seattle. So a lot of overlapping efforts in a short amount of time. And also keep in mind that only 20 years earlier they had that great fire. But, why let difficulty stop you? Oh, and don't let me forget that in the middle of all that, in 1896 to 1899, that's when all those individuals were going to the Klondike to strike it rich. Although the mainstream account tells us that not many people struck it rich in the Klondike. We even have other images that show us some more advanced and interesting rooms here within Smith Tower. And once again, I'm reminded of some of the unique rooms that we saw in the Cathedral of Learning when we did our exploration in Pittsburgh. Now, I'm by no means comparing these two buildings, but I am comparing the concept behind them. And indeed, we see more advanced construction and more intricacy and more effort put into this elevator. I mean, just think of how modern elevators look. And I know we'll be told that, well, because it's more convenient, it's more simple, and we prefer more streamlined modern construction. Yet, oddly enough, this elevator seems to have a little bit more thought put into the mechanism of it, and indeed the construction materials that went into it. I'm always reminded of how going back and opening an old brass door in an old 100-year-old farmhouse seems to have a little bit more quality to it than many of the modern door handles that you can go get at Home Depot to this day, or my personal least favorite, Menards. In any event, when you actually go around and look at these buildings, though, you can see that the floors also show the more advanced construction material, but we have older photos that show us that the building was always in this state. that these materials were always around and that they were not changed by the many renovations or modernizations that have occurred over time. And indeed, Seattle is no exception within that account in how they've modernized the city. Here's the penthouse apartment that for the low price of $17,000 a month or more now, you could actually live in. An interesting construction in this. I mean, was this originally some sort of bell tower, or did this have some other function? Because the shape of the windows at the very top of this tower are quite intriguing. And they modernized it as a penthouse, and that's apparently what they're selling now. And I guess we should just be thankful that this wonderful building is still standing, because as you can see all around it, they've gone to great efforts to modernize Seattle by building our wondrous glass and steel towers. And in this close image here, I just ask you to consider this with some of the construction materials with the elevator door and the wall. What exactly is that? And how difficult do you think it was for them to bring all that in if it was indeed constructed in 1911 and 1914 as we're told? Yes, they even have a Chinese room in the Smith Tower because, well, why wouldn't you? And this is what I was referring to earlier when I talked about how this particular building related to the Cathedral of Learning over in Pittsburgh. Because you have these interesting rooms that are designated a certain way, and yet this is a very impressive room. Did someone just decide to lay out a Chinese room in 1911 and 1914? And I'm well aware that the mainstream account tells us that the Chinese were fully involved with construction of the railroad, and they have quite a presence in the west coast of the United States. Well, let's go to King Street Station, built in 1906. This would not be an exploration unless we actually looked at some sort of station, an Amtrak station, train station that just happens to have a very wondrous tower on top of it that's very well constructed and goes quite high into the sky. And indeed, you can see that this is still a very prominent landmark, and we can see Smith Tower behind it. And of course, in my humble opinion, these two structures in the foreground are much more aesthetically pleasing than the structures in the background, but that's just my opinion. Maybe you like the brutalist architecture, and that's fine if you do. Here in the older images, though, we can see that there were other structures that seemed to be existing with this particular station. Now, what's really the story behind all this? How exactly did the infrastructure support the construction of these wonderful edifices at the time? And I know I have many different catch terms for this, but when you look at other images in the immediate vicinity, you also see other signs of more advanced construction, such as this smokestack, a very interesting smokestack. Now, why am I paying such attention to a smokestack? It's rather unique, and it really protrudes in that particular area. Looking at the station, though, we can see that it's a little bit larger than initially meets the eye, and I always enjoy these contrasts here where you have the little horse and buggy parked up around the very large station. What exactly is going on here, it's hard to say. The interior is no less opulent and ornate, where we can see that full detail and thought has been put into the walls, the pillars, and then, of course, the very well-decorated ceiling, because that's something else that's easy to do. And I'm sure that they built this building in a very short amount of time, because if there's one thing we know about Seattle, because of all the effort they had to make into rebuilding buildings with the fire and then all the other buildings that they tore down as part of the regrading effort for, reasons, that's why we're left with structures such as this that can suddenly be erected in a very short amount of time. We can even see that they tell us that they replaced a little bit of the ceiling within this particular station. So once again, we have another old world building that's not completely authentic, but for the most part, it's safe to say, like nice portal window there, a couple portal windows, it's safe to say that this particular structure has managed to reach us relatively intact. And indeed, in this image, we can see that most of the walls and the pillars that are integrated within the walls, again, a very impressive sign of construction, endure to this day. So, something to be positive about. Now let's look at Central Library, 1906 to 1957. This is a Carnegie Library. A very wondrous building as these Carnegie libraries were, and look how it's built in the hill. But we're told that the public was dissatisfied with it, that they didn't think that this was a pretty building. They didn't really like it. And looking on the interior, I can't imagine why anybody would think that, but I can't really speak to what the actual tastes of the denizens of Seattle in the 1950s were. But what we're told by the media and the historical account is that people didn't like this Carnegie Library. They just thought that it wasn't good enough and it didn't look pretty enough. So they tore it down in the late 1950s after a lot of haggling, or so we're told. And yes, I use the word haggling very directly because there's really no word to describe why anybody would tear down a building like this. This is a gorgeous building. Why wasn't this added to the National Register of Historic Places? We're told that this was a Beaux Arts library and this is from Carnegie. How could they tear down this building? Well, because they were dissatisfied with it. So how difficult was it for them to tear it down? How long did it take? We replaced it with this lovely modern library in 2004, and you can see the best examples of our construction efforts now, and I'm sure the Seattle public is very satisfied with this building. Now let's look at the old Federal Building, 1932. Yes, I had to include an Art Deco building with this initial exploration of Seattle. It's a rather intriguing one. We have seen this design before, but it's interesting where it shows up and where it doesn't. I'm kind of surprised that this wasn't some sort of palace or castle or some sort, and that we're told it's just simply a federal building. And oddly enough, I was at a loss to try to find interior images for this particular structure. So again, if you're in Seattle and you can access this building, I would love to see interior images. Very wondrous construction, though, with the integration of different construction blocks and what looks to be brickwork, although who knows exactly what this is made out of. It seems to be enduring quite well to this day. And indeed, I wonder what kind of uses this building has really had. And once again, we have a postcard of it. So remember, we can add postcard, wedding venue, Ken Burns documentary special for an indication that we're looking at a genuine, bona fide, old world structure. But just going off the beauty, and once again, you can see in the postcard how it's built in the terrain. I thought they did regrading. Well, maybe they just didn't regrade everywhere. And we can see that there's been some modern redecoration attempts on this building. So that's why I'm wondering what it's being used for today. What's that say down there in the lower left? Jack's teller sucks? Oh well. Looking at some of the other images, though, we can see that what we're told with this federal building is that they had removed other buildings and hotels in terms of where it stands now. What I'm always fascinated by, though, when considering these multiple buildings in the same location is we seem to have this account quite a lot. And here in this particular image, you can see the original construction techniques along with the more modern method of marking the building, which looks better to you. I'm not going to tell you what to think in this particular case. I'm just posing the question. And here we have the Hotel Rainier, and unfortunately, the Hotel Rainer. Mount Rainier, Mount Rainer. I'm just having fun. It's interesting, though, how the structure is so wonderful, and I'm trying not to lament the loss of such a beautiful structure. What is this building over here in the background? Nice little dome and a little pediment on there. Can anybody tell me what that building is in Seattle? Well, we have the Garfield High School, and it's only fitting that they'd have a high school named after President Garfield since they decided to do a memorial service for him in Seattle when he was assassinated in 1881. And we've seen this type of high school before with the wonderful decorations and once again something else that stands out. And we've seen that emblem, that cartouche on the top floor before. It's funny how many times that comes up. Oddly enough, though, you won't see any sort of meaning or symbolism behind it in any of the official American books that we have that talk about what symbolism was being used in the 1800s. Well, I'm sure if it was close enough to Egyptian, we could just consider that American, because in the 1800s, anything and everything Egyptian was actually American. And there it is again with that little cartouche up there. So again, I'm always fascinated by that. Let me know what you think of in the comments. Now, on the interior of this high school, we can see that they've modernized it quite a bit, but there are still some remnants of the old world structure. Indeed, as we look at this, what may have used to have been a stage, but now has been repurposed as a cafe. Oh well. Now let's look at some of these symbols here, and we'll pay attention to the symbolism. This is the arts and crafts symbol. What's being represented here? And is this exactly what was originally said? And I'm always fascinated by the intricate construction, the modularity that goes into these, although it doesn't appear in all of them. Botany, well, that's pretty straightforward. Interesting symbols, though, on the left and right of the botany there, and then down below. Very ornate and detailed, and I like how even the bricks are arrayed right below it. Again, as though no attention to detail is spared. Here we have industry. Looks like we have 3 connected spheres, a couple triangles, and then the mighty gear wheel of progress. Although, is that really what that's saying? I like the little clamshell up there behind the flame. Again, all these little intricate details and decorations that sometimes we gloss over, and I thought we'd take a little bit of time to look at. Well, a little book with intelligence. So read and regurgitate what you're told, and you will be intelligent. And we know that seems to be something that, is that really old world, or is that something that really reflects what we have in our current civilization? I'll let you answer that yourselves. Sciences. Science. Now, if this was something that was constructed today, we'd probably see an image of Carl Sagan up there because, who better represents it? Or our other good friend, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And if you had one that said skepticism, I have no doubt it would be our old friend, Brian Dunning. Look at that with the trades there. A little T-square and a hammer. And And again, I really appreciate the intricacy with the designs around these. And just think of the effort that we supposedly used to go through to construct our buildings. And here once again is that elusive skyline image in Seattle that you can actually see Mount Rainier. And yes, I am complaining that I was unable to get good footage of Mount Rainier when I had a UAV going over Seattle. So maybe some other time. I mean, drone or whatever you want to call it. Here's the Great Wheel in Seattle, and this was built in 2012 and has a maximum capacity of 300 people. Yes, it really compares favorably to the Ferris wheel in the Chicago World's Fair that was built in 1893 that could carry over 2,000 people. Okay, I'm not saying bigger is better, it's just an indicator of the capabilities of a civilization. And here's some of the other modern buildings that we have in Seattle. And it should be noted that Seattle is a very modernized city. And as we're told, it's the fastest growing city in the United States with 20% population growth from 2010 to 2020. Amazon headquarters. Again, another example of the greatest construction techniques of the 21st century. You would think that someone with all the resources as the Amazon CEO has would build a giant 1,000 foot tall statue of themselves. Well, let's look at some of the random lost buildings from 1800 to 1900, and maybe the reason that doesn't happen is because people have learned a little bit of subtlety over the years, or maybe if you want to be a robber baron, just build a very nondiscreet tall building. What's interesting about Seattle, though, is there are many lost buildings such as this, with many different purposes that we have assigned to them, and with the regrading and the fire, it should come as no surprise that these wondrous buildings have been lost. And once again, this particular structure here doesn't appear to have been made of wood, as we're told many were. And here we're even told in the official account that this is a wood building, and that's why it burned up in the fire. Now, does this really look like a wood building to you? It doesn't look like a wood building to me, but again, I just could be off in left field, and maybe I'm just not seeing it properly. When you look a little closer, does anything on the structure look like it was actually made of wood? Some of these buildings, though, are extremely impressive, and we've seen similar construction, but it's really unfortunate that we don't have more buildings like this across Seattle, because we see more identity and more artistic flair with some of these structures. Now again, that may just be my opinion, but when you look at this with the towers and the large balconies, it does give you the impression of a completely different kind of construction. And I'm just not accepting the fact that all this can be explained away by infinite logistics and no safety standards and robber barons. Here's the Denny Hotel, and this was a regrading casualty, and many of the structures that had Denny associated with them seem to be regrading casualties. They had to tear down these wondrous structures that somehow they were able to build in the late 1800s, early 1900s because of regrading. Well, why not? And here's another example with some of the arches and some of the more advanced construction. Now, I know Seattle's been covered by other great alternative researchers, but I wanted to get my little perspective on it because of the fact that I think there's some major indicators that has Seattle standing out to us. And indeed, we do have one of these impressive theaters in Seattle. And it should also be noted that there was a Fox Theater in Seattle that existed during the same time frame as the other Fox Theaters. Although, what's happened to Seattle is a little downtrodden enough. I don't want to make this too much of a downer of a video. This is supposedly one of the initial structures as part of what is today Washington University, or the Territorial University as they called it at the time. Nice cupola and some wondrous columns there. I don't know, it almost looks like something I'd expect to see down in Georgia or Alabama. Very unique. And then we have these other more advanced hotels that we don't actually have construction photos of, but we have renderings or sketches. And indeed, we could believe something like this stood because that's why we looked at the other images of other structures in Seattle. But how accurate is it? What's it really reflecting? And we can see that there are no shortage of wondrous hotels in Seattle, and indeed I wonder, how did the population of Seattle explode the way that it did? Are we to believe that it was all just prospectors going through the area, and then when things dried up in the Klondike, they decided to come back to Seattle and settle there? So here are the three big indicators of Seattle. We have population hyper-explosion. Call Robert Silverberg to design urban monads across the land from the novel The World Inside, because population in the world would be 3.5 trillion people. We had a great glue pot fire of 1889, and we had regrading for 30 years. So three major indicators from Seattle: large population explosion, another great fire, and then even regrading. So it seems as though there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. There's a much different history with Seattle. And where do we see Seattle as being? One of the major hubs, or one of the major forum areas in the previous era. Well, what are your thoughts on Seattle? And indeed, we're told that this particular structure was actually used as the library for a time before they got the Carnegie Library. Very nice structure. Was this a house? Was this a mansion? Or was this something else? But what are your thoughts on Seattle? What do you think the city really reflects? I have to say, it's been a very intriguing exploration, and this has been one of my favorites. Thank you for joining me. Welcome to the Rest to Orbis channel, and today we're going to be exploring the London Bridge, the marvelous mobile infrastructure of the United Kingdom. Ah yes, look at that lovely modern building, so aesthetically pleasing. There are many different crossings of the River Thames in London, and this is the more famous Tower Bridge, and it does play a part in the story. But we're going to explore London Bridge.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was, and the dream of what could be.
So why does London Bridge get our attention? Well, not only is it old world infrastructure, but it's also mobile old world infrastructure. They moved it from London in the United Kingdom or Great Britain into Arizona in the United States. And here in this article from History.com and our good friends here, we're going to examine this account. And remember, this was written by historians from History.com, so we know there is no conspiracy in this whatsoever. This is all as it really happened. In 1968, an American tycoon bought London Bridge, all 10,000 tons of it, and moved it brick by brick to the desert town of Lake Havasu City, Arizona. And yes, I say that very deliberately. In the early 1960s, officials in England made a troubling discovery. London Bridge was falling down. The 1,000-foot span had stood for over 130 years and survived strafing during World War II's London Blitz, but it was unequipped for modern traffic, and it was slowly sinking into the River Thames at a rate of 1 inch every 8 years. Horrifying. Renovations were deemed impractical, so the City of London resolved to build a wider, more car-friendly replacement. Yes, the infrastructure renewal of the 1960s. The 19th century granite bridge seemed destined for the junkyard. Really? But a city councilor named Ivan Lucken convinced his colleagues that it might be possible to sell it in the United States. Of course, the Americans. Who else would buy such a thing? In 1968, he crossed the pond to market the monument to prospective buyers. Lucken knew that London Bridge might be a tough sell, completed in 1831, so, as we know, bona fide old world architecture, from a design by engineer John Rennie. It was the less glamorous successor of several other crossings, most notably the medieval London Bridge, which stood for 600 years and was once dotted with buildings and water wheels, and we'll take a look at that. Londoners considered the existing bridge dull by comparison, but after arriving in America, Lucken promoted it as a timeless landmark. London Bridge is not just a bridge, he announced in a press conference in New York. It is the heir to 2,000 years of history going back to the 1st century AD to the time of Roman Londinium. Of course. The London Bridge sales pitch raised more than a few eyebrows in the United States, but for one businessman, it seemed like a natural fit. Robert McCulloch was a Missouri-born industrialist who had made millions, heading up companies that sold oil, motors, and chainsaws. Ah, we have a chainsaw baron here. Shamelessly eccentric, he once told a reporter that the secret of his success was booze and broads, his words. The tycoon also had a penchant for pursuing pie-in-the-sky business schemes. The most recent had come in 1963 when he purchased thousands of acres of land near Arizona's Lake Havasu, an isolated body of water created by a dam on the Colorado River. How fitting that when I explored the Hoover Dam, someone had made a comment that its real intention was to actually control the flow of water down the river. Well, this seems to corroborate that account. Very interesting that we go back to that. McCulloch had founded the community of Lake Havasu City at the site and had designs on making it a tourist oasis, because why not? What else do you do with a desert? But he was still struggling to attract visitors. Gee, I wonder why. When his business associate, C.V. Wood, yes, that's the name, told him about London Bridge, the two concluded that it was just the kind of eye-catching centerpiece Lake Havasu needed. McCulloch even hatched a plan to carve one of the lake's peninsulas into an island so the bridge would have something to span. I had this ridiculous idea of bringing it to the Arizona desert, he later joked to the Chicago Tribune magazine. I needed the bridge, but even if I didn't, I might have bought it anyway. Why does this not sound like the machinations of a successful business entrepreneur, but rather the ideas that someone like Homer Simpson or Al Bundy would come up with? I mean, it's certainly not something you'd see from Mr. Burns. Negotiations for the purchase proceeded rapidly during the spring of 1968. According to McCulloch, the most difficult part was hashing out a sales price with the City of London authorities. We poured an awful lot of scotch trying to loosen them up enough to give us some idea of how much they wanted, he told the Chicago Tribune magazine. Finally, after learning that dismantling the bridge would cost London $1.2 million, McCulloch and Wood decided to offer double that amount. As a sweetener, McCulloch tackled on an additional $60,000, $1,000 for each year he would be when the bridge reopened at Lake Havasu. In April 1968, for a final price of $2,460,000, Robert McCulloch became the proud owner of the world's largest antique. That's about $21.8 million in today's money. Look at this. And of course, in this article, they have how the Statue of Liberty got across the Atlantic. There was never any issue with moving large-scale Old World infrastructure across the Atlantic, not in the 1800s, and certainly not in the 1960s. With their purchase secured, McCulloch and Wood embarked on the Herculean task of moving London Bridge to the United States. I thought it was easy. It's the 20th century, after all. Workers began by labeling each of its granite bricks with markers that indicated their arch span, row number, and position, so it seems like they brought every single block, just like the article promised. The bridge was then disassembled, packed away in crates, and shipped to Long Beach, California, via the Panama Canal. Because, you don't go around South America. That's just silly talk. From there, a small army of trucks carried it across the desert to its new home at Lake Havasu. To ensure the bridge could handle modern traffic, construction crews built a hollow core of steel-reinforced concrete, which was then covered with 10,000 tons of the original 19th century granite. Wait a minute. So they indicate that they moved the entire way to the bridge, but then they also say that they constructed a new core to handle this problem of this bridge supposedly eroding and disintegrating, which is why they were going to tear it down in London in the first place. But then they renovated the bridge, and then they brought over all the blocks. The painstaking assembly process took place over a small strip of land that connected a peninsula to the mainland. But as the project neared completion, workers cut a mile-long channel through the isthmus and allowed it to fill with water, creating an island. So not only did they buy the bridge, not only did they move the bridge, they also had to do massive excavation and land engineering to create the conditions to actually put the bridge there. This just sounds like total lunacy. This doesn't even sound like some crazy business scheme of the likes of Al Bundy or Homer Simpson. All told, the shipping, assembly, and dredging took over 3 years and cost some $7 million. 7 times as much as McCulloch had spent on the land that made up Lake Havasu City. Really? He spent $1 million for that land? Never mind. Finally, on October 10th, 1971, London Bridge was ready for its debut in the United States. In typically flamboyant fashion, McCulloch dedicated the monument in a ceremony that included skydivers, fireworks, marching bands, hot air balloons, and a dinner banquet featuring lobster and roast beef, the same meal that had been served to King William IV during the bridge's original unveiling in 1831. Isn't it intriguing that they document what meal they served King William IV during the bridge's original unveiling in 1831? Never mind. London's Lord Mayor attended clad in his black ceremonial robes and accompanied by a sword bearer, and celebrities Robert Mitchum and Dan Rowan were on hand to add some star power. It's a super gimmick, the New York Times quoted one British newsman as saying. It's all quite mad. It could only happen in America. Only an American would think of investing that much in something as crazy as this. Yes, I certainly agree with that assessment. It's also very interesting that British would be willing to sell their cultural heritage to the Americans, but that is very well documented and apparently happened all through the 1800s into the 1900s. So, nothing new there. Here's a picture of Mr. Wood, president of the McCulloch Corporation, standing under the almost London Bridge near Lake Havasu City. Interesting terminology there. The reporter wasn't the only one who considered the London Bridge project a crackpot scheme. By 1971, the purchase had become widely known as McCulloch's Folly. It sounds about right. And many predicted that he and Wood would live to regret it. There was even a rumor, since discredited, that the Americans had been duped into thinking they were buying the more iconic Tower Bridge. That was the bridge we looked at the start of the video. In the end, however, it was McCulloch and Wood who had the last laugh. Their whimsical purchase proved to be the marketing ploy that Lake Havasu City needed. From a population of just a few hundred in the early 1960s, the town blossomed over 10,000 residents by 1974. In 1975, its Chamber of Commerce reported that the bridge had drawn nearly 2 million visitors the previous year. Robert McCulloch would later gamble on several other far-fetched business schemes before his death in 1977, including promoting helicopter-like gyroplanes as commuter vehicles, but Lake Havasu City proved to be his greatest success. The town he built from scratch is now home to over 50,000 full-time residents and boasts a thriving tourist industry. London Bridge, still standing after 185 years on 2 continents, remains its most recognizable landmark. Let's take a closer look at London Bridge and its predecessors. And why exactly did this work? Is it really that easy just to bring some amazing landmark from another nation into the United States? And even if you're in some desolate desert, you can attract visitors and settlers and people who are willing to come because, hey, London Bridge is there. Let's take a look. The Old London Bridge, 1209 to 1831. We have to go back to the days of King Henry II and King John to look at the original construction of Old London Bridge. And it was a medieval stone bridge that even had what they called houses, although it was subsequently a marketplace, as we're told. We don't have any actual pictures of it because, this bridge existed for 600 years before the invention of photography. Regardless, we have accounts that it's a very impressive medieval bridge, and certainly we can see why the people of London would believe that the subsequent bridge was not up to the task of equaling it. The bridge made a cameo appearance under construction during Ridley Scott's 2010 Robin Hood film. Yes, perhaps one of Ridley Scott's last passable efforts, although the film had mixed reviews. It was certainly better than that TV series, in my humble opinion, that came out in the 2000s, where I kept expecting Robin Hood and Marian to pull out their cell phones and call each other. But enough of that. We can actually see the bridge under construction when we see this image from the movie, so Ridley Scott can be given credit for being somewhat historically accurate before he decided to go into a disinterested-looking Napoleon. Okay, I really have to stop talking about that. Regardless, though, the Old London Bridge was a very impressive structure, and here you can see its many great arches and stonework and the structures that were built on top of it. Now, the reason we're told that these structures were built on top of it was to establish a marketplace, and I suppose that makes sense from many perspectives, but you can quickly see, though, that the older bridge is much more elaborate, much more extravagant than anything we have in the modern bridges. And of course, the explanation will be because we have traffic, we have automobiles, we have buses, we have large semi-tractor trailers that have to drive over the bridge. So, I'm sorry, we can't construct an elaborate bridge like this now because it's just not practicable. But in the past, they had a market there that everybody went to, and we're told it was one of the busiest markets in London back during the day. There's also the very impressive reality that this bridge lasted for 600 years until it was demolished in 1831. And again, we don't have any actual pictures of it. We have drawings, we have sketches, we have paintings. And what an unfortunate loss that a bridge that had stood for 600 years was torn down. And I'm still impressed by the fact that this bridge stood for over 600 years. Yeah, yes. Look at that structure there in the background. And here we see the construction of the new London Bridge, or the London Bridge that we looked at that was subsequently moved to Arizona. Watch out, there may be space vampires in that dome building back there. But we're told that the old bridge stood during the construction of the new bridge, and then once the new bridge was constructed, then they tore down the old bridge, and that's where we had that account of the dinner that was served to the king. So quite fascinating, the details that they track. And again, we have a painting that shows the demolition of the old bridge next to the new bridge. And remember that the new bridge was considered boring by current standards. And as you saw with the old London Bridge, you can certainly see why someone would make that assessment. But it has to be noted, though, that the quote-unquote new London Bridge, or the one that was moved from London to Arizona, is an impressive piece of work. Because did they really know that when they were going to build this bridge, they were actually going to move it block by block across the ocean, or the pond as they euphemistically call it? And here I actually show different images of the bridge in London and the bridge in Arizona, and I certainly ask you to make your comparisons in terms of what they look like. What's really going on here? How is it possible that old world architecture could be pulled down and moved across an ocean 100 years after its existence? Why is it that we have all these accounts, though, of this architecture having this capability of being moved? And what does this really tell us about its durability? Or let's be completely kind here. Let's assume that the story did actually happen as we're told, that they really constructed this bridge in the 1830s in London. It was starting to fall apart in the 1960s or sink, and they decided to sell it. What does this tell you, though, about the quality of construction, that even with these shortfalls, they were able to move this bridge, and then supposedly they were able to refine it just a little bit in the middle of the desert, which, for those of you who live in the desert, you know the desert's not exactly the easiest location on infrastructure. Establish it there, and then have it work and function to this day as a modern bridge that can actually convey the heavy traffic that we discussed earlier over it. What does that really tell you? If you take history at face value, then what we've learned is that our capability in engineering constructions has diminished quite immensely. Because can we even build a modern bridge that we could move across continents and that would still be able to suit purposes that it was never designed for? Because it's certain to say that when London Bridge was originally designed, the engineer had no idea that it was going to be moved across the ocean and put in the middle of a desert, in a place where nobody really wanted to be. And yes, it's very well documented that Arizona was not a place anybody wanted to be, but we're told that the establishment of the great historical landmark of the London Bridge, which so many people in the United States apparently cared about in the 1960s, that they all flocked in mass droves to settle Lake Havasu. And indeed, the population figures do corroborate that. Of course, it's also with the help of establishing several factories that didn't exist in Lake Havasu and someone just deciding to pour money in there. But that's always the answer, isn't it? It's always money, and once you have those resources locked into place, you can essentially do anything. Although perhaps the better question is, why don't we have our current great entrepreneurs and many billionaires that we're told we have so many of doing projects like this currently? I mean, we have more technological capability in the 2020s than we did in the 1960s. Why doesn't someone else get a grand idea to move old world architecture from, well, what they would call the old world, Europe, Asia? I mean, really, you could move anything anywhere. If you could do this with a bridge, what's to stop you from doing anything else? It's fascinating to me, though, the account that they had each of the individual blocks marked, and they were able to seamlessly transport every block of the bridge across the ocean and then reassemble it in the middle of the desert. So when you really take this account at face value, what's it telling you? There's also the analysis on some of the photos that we have. For one, it's bizarre that there are some black and white photos, although I suppose we can write that off as color photography was relatively new in the 1960s, depending on your perspective. And we have rather bizarre images that show us how they dug out the waterway to establish this supposed island on this isthmus in Arizona. It's really bizarre, though, when you see some of the images, because it almost gives you the impression that the bridge itself was being dug out of the dirt. Now, maybe that's just the way the images appear, but, I can only convey to you what I see in the image, and I wasn't there personally. Perhaps there's someone who was there personally who can tell us their first-hand account about the construction, or should I say the reassembly of London Bridge in Lake Havasu City in Arizona. Because certainly there's got to be some people who witnessed this and could tell us exactly what was going on here. Because however you pull this account out, whether it's taken at face value or we think that something else may have been going on, it's really strange. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And if it is this simple to move old world architecture from other continents to the United States or places where they have money, then why not do it all the time? In fact, why did China not simply offer France a lot of money to move the Eiffel Tower from Paris to one of their newer cities in China? Imagine what a tourist draw that would be. We have the original Eiffel Tower. And when you look at these images, you do get those questions about something strange going on with the construction of this bridge. Yes, indeed, they had to excavate this area, and yet in these images, it almost looks like they are digging the bridge out and renovating it. It's very strange. And I'm not really sure exactly what to make of it. I mean, are the images reflecting reality, or is there something else going on? We have another example of our written account not matching what we see in the images. Well, there's nothing new about that when we do enough of these explorations. There's also all this bizarre fanfare with the opening of this bridge. And we're to believe that the official account is that they managed to basically sell a bridge to an American entrepreneur. And that bridge managed to attract people to the middle of a desert. And that's the official account that we have. But I certainly ask you to offer your opinions in the comments. What do you think happened with this particular London Bridge? Was this bridge really moved across continents, as we're told, across the simple pond of the Atlantic Ocean? Or is there a much different account? A much different story that accompanies this old-looking London Bridge that just happens to be in the desert in Arizona? Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the area, I just wanted to give you an idea of where the London Bridge has been moved to and where Lake Havasu City in Arizona actually is. So you can see that we're in the southwestern United States. This is where it's located, right along the border of Arizona and California. And when you look at our great aerial imagery, yes, very realistic looking aerial imagery. Let's get in a little closer where you can actually see the real aerial imagery. And you can see that this is a wasteland, a desert. Now, nothing against the desert, but for people who grew up in the desert, they're used to it. But for people who didn't grow up in the desert, it's quite a shock and a change. And you can see that this is all very arid terrain, and there's really nothing there. And this is where they ended up moving London Bridge to. And this is the peninsula that they created and the waterway that they cut out. So they would actually have a spot to put the bridge on. Although it does look like they kind of dug the bridge out, but maybe that's just what the images are conveying. Not really sure. But when you look at it to this day, and you can find some good views of it, you can get an idea and an appreciation for the original block work, that all the blocks are still there from London Bridge, looking at it very closely. And this little crackpot scheme at the time succeeded brilliantly in making Lake Havasu City grow in the middle of the desert. And so I had to ask myself, well, why doesn't some other entrepreneur apply this model somewhere else? And the example I want to go with here is zooming back out, but in the same desert, is here between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, we have what's called the I-15 corridor. And on the I-15 corridor, you have a series of towns that people are driving past as fast as they can on I-15 to go from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, essentially every Friday night or the day preceding a holiday weekend. And then on Sunday evening or Monday morning, it's busy on the southbound lane as people drive from Las Vegas back to Los Angeles. And these little desert communities tend to be bypassed. But I was thinking, the small community of Baker, which is just out here in the middle of nowhere, and they tried their little gimmick themselves with the world's tallest thermometer that's in Baker, because it's not too far from Death Valley. Imagine, though, if some well-to-do entrepreneur decided to follow this business model of moving old world architecture to Baker. Imagine if they brought something like, say, Calton Hill, all of Calton Hill from Edinburgh, and built it, say, on the north side of Baker. And why stop there? They could even bring a piece of Arthur's Seat. I mean, they've got the desert. They've got plenty of space. And remember, this is the 21st century. There are no limitations in what we could do with our modern technology and equipment. And then you could build a couple factories, whether you're building cars or computers, or you actually have the largest distribution service in the world, so we're told. Then suddenly you could make Baker a very large and amazing city. And you can see it has plenty of terrain to grow out, all because you decided to attract people by building, or should I say moving, all of Calton Hill and the structures and part of Arthur's Seat to Baker. You can even have a grand opening ceremony here in Baker, where you could invite some actor who has absolutely nothing to do with this. I don't know, maybe we could get Ron Perlman if he's not too busy, or even Kurt Russell. And I don't mean that as an insult to Kurt Russell. Kurt Russell actually believes in originality, and he should be credited for that. But wouldn't that just be amazing if they could do this same model in Baker by moving old world architecture, my favorite Nelson's Monument, to Baker? And then suddenly you have this model that works perfectly, and Baker grows to a large city of over 200,000 people. And then the next thing you know, they decide to establish casinos there, and suddenly Las Vegas is no longer the draw that it was. Anyway, what are your thoughts on this entire model of this movement of old world architecture? What are your thoughts on the existence of London Bridge? Is this the actual London Bridge that was constructed and moved from London? Or is there something more to this story? Well, thanks for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
This isn't an ordinary fight. This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and I thought we would go back to some basics and take a look at a more genuine exploration of Los Angeles. Now, more genuine by looking at a photo album. Of course, we know that when we look at photos, we have the usual challenges. Are the photos accurate? Have they been altered? Is the chronology on the photos accurate? We're going to take this at face value, though, and see what they show us. And Los Angeles is intriguing because of its location and the fact that it's essentially in a very arid area. And one of the other things we'll be exploring are the water wars that had to occur in the 1800s and the early 1900s in order to allow Los Angeles to flourish as a city, because it lacks water. Here we have a view of the southeast corner of Temple Street and Broadway, showing the county courthouse and the Hall of Records. And you can see this is the exact thing you'd expect for a county courthouse in the early 1900s. Some sort of sandstone or limestone, at least that's what we'll be told, very elaborate stairs. I like how they have the slant construction. They've built this up on a hill, and here we have the Hall of Records, a very impressive building itself. So right off the bat, they're already showing us that there are very impressive and unique buildings that are available in Los Angeles in the early 1900s. I mean, how can you have a county courthouse without a cupola? How can you have a county courthouse without little subsidiary towers with smaller cupolas or domes on it? And even a dome back here. Impressive. Now let's look at it from a different perspective. And I like how on this image they say county courthouse. They don't have to spell out Los Angeles. You know it's the Los Angeles County Courthouse. And is this the Hall of Records as well? Yeah, we got some little domes here in the Hall of Records. Now, we've actually seen this type of architecture before with this tower, and we've seen it with several Union stations. We've seen it at the City Hall in Minneapolis and Minnesota. So again, they seem to embrace that style and build it all over the place, because getting the sandstone and the limestone where it needed to be and having the architects and the contractors that could build buildings like that, well, it was easy to achieve. At least that's what we'll be told. Very impressive structure and very unique view of Los Angeles. I like how we just have people sitting around. Something seems off about the image, though, doesn't it? Got a little blur with the vehicle right here on the road. Early cars. And we already have a nice, impressive monument out in front of it. And keep in mind that when we did the exploration of Los Angeles, we know that a lot of these buildings are newer. And here we have a close-up view of Los Angeles County Courthouse viewed through the colonnade of the recently completed City Hall. Recently completed. Where exactly were these columns constructed? And how did they get this fine detailing on them? And look at the detail right here, in between the arches. Impressive. And as if that's not impressive enough, you can see the Hall of Records in the City Hall again. Again, early 1900s, because there were a lot of people in California, and they all knew how to build buildings just like this. Or so we'll be told. Broadway Christian Church. And isn't this a nice little church right here? Oh, I like how they have the door down here in the ground. But then you've got stairs going up to the door up here on the second floor. So 1, 2, 3 floors, maybe a nice little attic, and very intriguing domes with little spires on the domes, because, how are you going to know it's a Christian church unless you have domes with little spires on it? And I like the palm tree right there. Interesting, though, with some of the foundation stones. And again, you have the little entryway with the spheres on top of it. Very elaborate banisters. You can't do a church without banisters. And even looking at the windows and the decoration on the windows. Oh, it's Victorian style, of course. Located across the street from the county courthouse. So you're going into Los Angeles and you realize it's a new city and you see these very impressive structures. Hotel Ford. Oh. And look at this. And again, we can see some of the detailing on this with the Hotel Ford. And we can see this is one of these more classic structures that will be told it's a manor or it's in some sort of Second Empire architectural style. And what do they tell us about it? Where it's located, this is the future site of the Bank of Italy building. In this photo, it is Hotel Ford with a dentist office above. It's also known as the United States Hotel. Knickerbocker buildings off to the right. Yeah, it's quite impressive, isn't it? Open night and day. Just feels like they slapped that on there. And go see your dentist. Wonder what kind of great dental work you could get done in the early 1900s. Oh, 1921. So it's after World War I. Bank of Italy building today. Nice colonnades right there. Little columns and baseline structures. Views showing the newly constructed Bank of Italy. The building is a neoclassical base supporting office block. A rusticated base with 3-story monumental colonnades. Date built 1922. So they decided to build it so it already looked old and then put some colonnades out in front of it. The more of these structures I look at, I do question what exactly is going on. And here's another view of it. 1920s. And all these photos are from the 1920s. Interesting thing going on with the flag there. Getting picked up by those Santa Ana winds already. And here we have Lowe's State Theater. And here they show us a very convincing, sarcasm at max, construction photo. You always know it's a convincing construction photo when they have this little information block in the lower corner. I recall looking at the Buffalo City Hall and we saw that. Look at some of the construction detailing, though, on this. Now, it looks like they're just putting up girders. And yet when you look at what Lowe's Theater looks like when it's complete, we suddenly have this. Yes, more rusticated stone, as we'll be told. It was aged because they wanted that aged appearance on it. And so we're to believe that this is the result of this construction photo. Well, if you want to believe it, maybe that's good enough to convince you, be my guest. I don't see any issues with it. Sarcasm meter high again. And again, we have a construction site, but we just have vehicles cruising right on by. We've got people walking on by. It's no problem. 1921. But then the next photo is dated 1921. So make of it what you will. It didn't take long. We could put them up really quickly then. We had no safety standards. There were no modern amenity distractions. And then again, we have this corner sign here, Lowe's Theater. But yet you see 1924, 3 years later, and it looks like the structure's been standing for hundreds of years. But That's explained by the rusticated stone. Lots of people suddenly around in Los Angeles. Didn't take long. Trolleys going every which direction. View from above. Downtown's busiest intersection, Lewis State Theater, is playing Syncopating Sue, starring Corinne Griffith. Syncopating Sue. What an interesting name for a film. You'd never see a film titled that today. Well, I guess they expanded their vocabulary base with what they were showing. And again, look how old the theater looks. And just unbelievably crowded. It almost seems like another world. Now we move on to the Eagle Rock City Hall, 1923, showing detail facade and front entrance. Built in 1922 and was designed by architect William Lee Woollett. 1 year. Look at that facade. Yes, of course, that's exactly what you need on a city hall. You need some large columns and some very interesting adornments on top of the columns. Intriguing photograph. And indeed, they all are. Angelus Temple. Now look at this. It's almost as though, here we have the columns that are built in the wall. We actually have an extension, a circular rotunda area. Bible school and Amy Semple McPherson's residence. Wow. So back in the day when you could operate a Bible school and it could be a residence as well. I suppose this is the amalgamation of Bible school and residence architectural style. What do you really call this? Neoclassical with residence? Very intriguing structure. And what's the explanation on this? Exterior view of the Bible school. Founder of the Foursquare Church. Amy Semple McPherson. And as we well know, nothing represents the interests of the church better than having a very elaborate and well-adorned building. And you may as well have a great residence as well. Because what else would it be? And here we have nighttime view of the temple. Yeah, it's quite a temple, isn't it? And where did the money for this come from, I wonder? Well, don't ask. It was the early 1920s. Lots of money available. Look at this auditorium on the inside. Evangelist Amy Semple McPherson leading a song during Foursquare Gospel Church service at the Angelus Temple in 1930. So this is once the Great Depression had started, but maybe it didn't hit California so quickly. Very impressive balconies, and quite a layout for a temple. In her time, she was the most publicized Christian evangelist, surpassing Billy Sunday and her other predecessors. She conducted public faith healing demonstrations before large crowds, allegedly healing tens of thousands of people. McPherson's articulation of the United States as a nation founded and sustained by divine inspiration continues to be echoed by many pastors and churches today. News coverage sensationalized misfortunes with family and church members, particularly inflaming accusations she had fabricated her reported kidnapping, turning it into a national spectacle. McPherson's preaching style, extensive charity work, and ecumenical contributions were a major influence in revitalization of American evangelical Christianity in the 20th century. Wow, very impressive structure. You can see a little dome on the top of it, appears. And it looks like they're all set for their broadcast. I wonder what the origin of this building truly was. Exterior view, Glendale Boulevard and Park Avenue. Continuous revival. Radio towers for the church's radio station, KFSG, are visible on the roof. Oh, you had your own church radio stations back then. Very impressive. Oh, she was a noted pioneer in the use of modern media, especially radio, and the second woman to be granted a broadcast license. Nice how has the sign right there on the structure. And again, looking at the columns that are integrated into the structure. So it's a residence, it's a Bible school. Wonder exactly what the construction material was. Oh, looks like we have a little bit of a flood here. 1940, sloshing through the flooded street in front of Angelus Temple in Echo Park. Now, I'll admit, I had absolutely no awareness of this particular individual. Postcard view. Does that really look like a postcard, or does that actually look like a photograph? Again, an impressive structure. Again, this looks like a photograph that they put on a postcard. So apparently at this point, they were beyond just doing the drawn, painted pictures for postcards. Here we actually have photographs that are postcards. Almost as though someone's looking to obscure the official account. Oh, 1998, Echo Park and its lake are visible. The famed Angelus Temple with its dome roof can be seen on the lower left, and downtown LA skyscrapers sit majestically in the background. Very impressive. And now we head to the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. The Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum is not to be confused with the Rose Bowl, because this is the Coliseum where the USC Trojans play. Now, here we go. It was built about the same time, though, as the Rose Bowl. Aerial view showing the early stages of the construction. The arches and east entranceway are already in place. Well, of course they are. I mean, you have to start somewhere when you're building a giant coliseum, right? And yet here we have these other very interesting construction photos. So 1922, again, the exact same time frame as the Rose Bowl over in Pasadena. Construction continues. Large stadium was built in less than 2 years. I'm surprised it even took them that long. And you might recall during our stadium exploration where we were positing explanations behind some of these stadiums. Again, another stadium that it just looks like they dug it out. But then again, who knows on the veracity of some of these images. It is intriguing to consider it. And yes, I have actually watched games at this Coliseum and have waited for the great crowd and watched as the good people of Los Angeles supported their team. And for the longest time, the USC Trojans were the professional team of Los Angeles. Fortunately for Los Angeles, that's not the case anymore if you're a football fan. Very interesting layout, though, looking at the stadium and the way that everything is intricately brought together. Now, again, asking that question because there's problems with some of these construction photos. They seem to allude to different things, and we have to wonder what exactly is going on with these images. Aerial view looking north showing an almost completed Coliseum. The next step is the landscaping. Well, let's see if we get that. View showing the first football game, USC versus Pomona. Yeah, something tells me USC is not taking on any sort of opponents like Pomona anymore. Very odd, though. Look at all the empty stands in this for a USC game. Can you imagine that? I mean, for the longest time, you would have people just lined up for hours for pregame festivities and just waiting to get into this Coliseum and packing every seat. And it didn't matter whether Pete Carroll was the coach or whoever, this entire stadium was full. But look at this very interesting image. As though we don't have enough people to fill it, or we don't have enough interest in football at that time to fill the stadium. The origin of sports in the United States and the Western world is quite intriguing as well. The big three: football, basketball, baseball. Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum opened on June of 1923. Some 5 months later, first football game played there. Crowd of 12,836. Yeah, very different, huh? Who knows on the accuracy of those counts. Oh, there we go. That's more like it. 1930. Preparation for the 1932 Olympics. Note the Olympic torch has yet to be installed. And they packed the house for the Olympics back then. Interesting when you look at the roads that run around it as well, and the geometric precision of how they laid out the entire stadium. And then here we have, I love this. They pull up a car within the stadium. Yeah, I don't think you'd see that today, unless they're actually down on the field. Oh, it's a Ford Model A parked behind the wooden bleachers. Yes, the wooden bleachers. Note the torch we see today would not be installed until 1930. You really have to wonder on some of these images, especially with the Coliseum. And here we have the El Capitan Theater. 2020 view looking up at the El Capitan Theater, as seen from in front of the old Hollywood Masonic Temple, now the El Capitan Entertainment Center. And of course, you need to have fine columns to have an excellent entertainment center. It all makes sense. Don't question it. Los Angeles Normal School. Now, that was interesting terminology from the 1800s to the early 1900s. They always had all these normal schools all over the land. Millspaw Hall at the Los Angeles State Normal School on Vermont Avenue, later to become UCLA. Students can be seen sitting in the shade in the eucalyptus tree. And look at that dome back there. And this is something that we see with universities across not just the United States, but everywhere. Very elaborate, intricate construction that was done at a very early time frame. Well, I guess we all took education very seriously. And I suppose that makes sense. Closer photos showing some of the impressive construction of this dome or cupola structure, some of the arches, and how long has this really been here? 1925. Oh, it's already ivy covered, and we have Beaux Arts style. Oh yes, that should send off the alarms right there whenever they say it's Beaux Arts. Very intriguing just looking at some of these smaller buildings around Los Angeles. The Egyptian Theater. Now here's where things get interesting. 1922, view looking east on Hollywood Boulevard, showing the newly opened Egyptian Theater. It looks relatively modest, but as you start to look closer at it, you get a little bit of a different impression. 1922, and the original Robin Hood. I'll bet that was a good version of Robin Hood. I'll be honest, I haven't seen it. But look at some of this construction. Now, what exactly is this constructed out of? Well, I'm sure there's somebody in the comments who's going to tell me that my grandfather walked past that building and can tell you that it was just made out of some sort of stucco, and it was just a facade, it was not real. Looks pretty real to me, and if you're going to be running people under there, definitely makes you wonder. And here in the interior, now again, are these just displays? Is this just something that they put up as part of a great novelty? Everybody was into what was Egypt in the early 1900s. We got an Egyptian king. I thought it was a pharaoh. Indian elephants, billboard advertising, The Thief of Baghdad. That is a good film. I have actually seen it. And here we look at the interior. Looking at the stage, and look at some of the ornate detailing here. Now, what exactly is really going on? Did they really replicate Egypt to this extent just for a theater? Now, I don't care what this is actually built out of. This took a lot of effort and a lot of time. And again, this is in the early 1920s. Now everyone will say, well, it's the roaring 1920s. It was an easy achievement. And look at all this decorative detailing here. But yet there's something unique about this. I mean, is this inspired by Egypt, or is this something else entirely? Those are the kind of questions we have to ask. Very elaborate and intricate theater. I would certainly love to go see a show at a theater that looked like that. And then looking back towards the audience and in the balcony, and again, you can see some of the ornate detailing. And look at some of this construction right here. Very impressive. Can never look at enough of these theaters. And then here it is in 1924. Railroad tracks can be seen on Hollywood Boulevard in front of the theater. Oh, yes, of course. And again, what's the actual construction nature of this? Was this something that was just sitting there? Or was this something they threw together really quickly just for a novelty? I mean, when you look closer, it does give you the impression that these are actual blocks. So much effort put into this, and all these theaters. I mean, everyone just thinks of the theaters that they know of in Los Angeles, but there were many more than we tend to think of. Now look at this, a bowling alley with columns around it. And this is Jensen's Recreational Center Complex in 1929. They tell us it's ornate Beaux Arts and Italianate style. Yes, it's exactly what you need, Beaux Arts, to have an effective bowling alley at that time. I mean, are these lights? These look to be lights, and what ornate decoration for lights, along with these columns and these balconies. Unbelievably impressive. I mean, we can't have an effective bowling alley today because we don't have these very beautiful ornate Beaux Arts columns in them. Or are they actually Italianate? I guess it just depends on who you ask. And here's what the front of it looks like. Jensen's Recreation Center. Nice little trophy there, and the interesting decorations on the facade. And this is yet another structure that you might be lulled into thinking isn't that ornate, but then when you go on the inside and you see this, I mean, why would anybody spend this kind of time arranging this for a bowling alley? Just don't ask. And some of the drug stores. Circle Drug Co. Remember when there used to be drugstores all across the nation? And we do have some more modern photos, and you can still see that the coloration of the bricks and the styling is still there. A little more obvious, though, in the older photo. Quite intriguing. Just make it black and white, and no one will be able to tell what time the photo was taken. And again, some of these patterns here with the brick. Wondrous brickwork in an older building. And now let's look at the Beverly Theater in Beverly Hills. Ah, yes, here we go, 1925. Newly built. And strangely enough, we have that odd dark line around it, as though someone were drawing around it, or it almost feels like the photo is superimposed. I'm not saying that it is, it just appears that way. Maybe my mind's just playing tricks on me. And look at some of this intricate work here. You know, are we in Los Angeles, or are we somewhere in Egypt again? Now this looks a little bit more of a better photo. This is from the 1920s. And yet, oddly enough, look at how the coloration, or at least the coloration of the stonework, appears on it. So a very interesting slew of theaters, as though they knew Los Angeles was going to be the center of the entertainment world. And they quickly built it up. Look at the stage here with some of the detailing on this. Very impressive. And here you can see in the 1970s, Beverly Hills with the domed Beverly Theater. Still stands out today. None of the other more recent buildings remotely compared to it. You got to look in the distance here, and you see something that compares to it. Ah, yes, there we go. Modernity, more of a modern display sign on this theater. But you can see it still retains a lot of its original excellence and natural beauty. And look at that close up showing the dome. Yeah, we just don't build domes anymore, do we? Or when we do, they're certainly not constructed in this manner. Because we have limitations and resources, and remember our aforementioned distractions. The Farmers and Merchants National Bank. Ah, yes, of course. This is exactly what we'd expect for a national bank. 1923. Architectural designs on the building. Yes, no doubt. But really, when you look at all the other buildings surrounding it, you do get a little bit more of an ornate construction behind them. All when they were initially established in Los Angeles, because it all makes perfect sense. Historical notes. Oh, classical revival style. One of Southern California's finest examples of early temples of finance. What a term, temple of finance, which were popular at the turn of the century. Why don't we still use that term? Sounds very descriptive. Two-story facade reminiscent of a Roman temple. I mean, I like this because they're actually spelling it out very clearly. It was the first incorporated bank in Los Angeles, founded in 1871 by 23 prominent Los Angeles businessmen, with an initial capital of $500,000. Makes sense. The three largest subscribers, and it lists them. Oh, one of the California governors. How about that? John G. Downey. Because everybody was just loaded with money back then. It was the 1800s, remember? Biltmore Hotel. And on to the Biltmore Hotel. 1923, people sit in Pershing Square while across the street, flag-decorated banners hang from the still unfinished Biltmore Hotel. Yes, unfinished. Are they actually cleaning it? Because again, it looks like it's been standing up there for quite a while. I've actually stayed at this hotel, and it is still a very impressive structure. The Los Angeles Biltmore Hotel opened in 1923. With its 1,500 guest rooms, it was the largest hotel west of Chicago. And you can see that it's a very impressive structure. And they have quite a layout. And indeed, the brick facade here on the walkway looks like it's been there for quite some time. The architectural firm Schultz and Weaver designed the Biltmore's exterior in a synthesis of Spanish, Italian, Renaissance Revival, Mediterranean Revival, and Beaux Arts styles. So I have to ask, whatever happened to all this amalgamation of styles that they were doing in the 1920s? We were just not creative anymore in the 2000s. We have to constantly rip off of what's already been done, rinse and repeat over and over again, whether it's our buildings, our structures, or our films. I'm just asking questions. I mean, look at that fountain out there. Why is it we can't do something like this today, or why don't we bother doing something like this today? And yes, I'm looking forward to the usual slew of reasons in the comments. Please, let me know what you think. Just tell me why. View of the Biltmore Hotel on the corner of 5th and Olive, and you can see in some of the colorations and the difference of the blockwork and the bricks on this. And yet here we have a little portal window, and it's a very impressive structure. Of course, the interior is no less impressive, and this photo here from the 1940s, ornate lobby, and it still looks like that today. It's very beautiful, and it definitely gives you the impression that you're in something very different. And of course, they had the time to do this kind of decoration on the ceiling, and we won't say anything about this very impressive chandelier. And a lot of this you can still see there today as you go into any of these old world buildings. Ah, 2-story tall ballroom. And of course, it's a real ballroom because you decorate the ceiling like this, and then you have chandeliers that are actually connected to the ceiling. And once again, no detail spared when they laid this out and constructed it in the early 1920s. Because remember, this is just when we're building anything and everything, right down to this handrail and even the decoration below it. Very impressive. And yes, you can still go stay in the Biltmore Hotel today. 1943. Yes. And they certainly weren't building structures like that during World War II. Look at the pediments above each of the doorways and then the elaborate archway. Nope, in World War II, we really weren't building anything anywhere. We're building ships, at least that's what the United States was doing. Lots of Essex-class carriers, 24 in 3 short years. Because remember, the United States was caught by surprise in Pearl Harbor. It still uses this terminology. You were Pearl Harbored. But it looks like these individuals are having a grand old time. View of the lower eastern facade. Buntings and a banner welcoming visiting groups. Has a little bit of a patriotic flavor to it. And here you can see some of the decoration above these windows. Very impressive. And once again, we have the pillars amalgamated into the wall. So it gives us a very different origin for this particular building. Or again, we go back to that question, why aren't we constructing buildings like this after World War II? It was just too difficult. We could figure out how to put together a vast naval armada and build aircraft carriers that operated in fleets of aircraft carriers, but after World War II, it was just too difficult to build buildings like this, because who would really want to see this, when you can see these nice glass and steel towers everywhere? There you go. See an example right there? That's the modern LA we think of. And yet, even though these buildings may be taller, for some reason, the structure here greatly exceeds them in terms of aesthetic appeal. But if you want to argue the point, by all means, let me know in the comments. And really, that's the purpose of this initial exploration, is just to get an idea of how Los Angeles has changed, because we can see its more modern incarnation, perhaps a completely different civilization, as opposed to its earlier incarnation. We're going to be exploring Los Angeles in more detail, and we're going to be considering the story of the water wars, or how they were actually able to bring water to the great LA basin. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'd love to stay, but